Welcome to the Odyssey of Empires, where we delve into the echoes of ancient civilizations. This week, we plunge into the turbulent heart of the Aztec Empire, a realm defined by unimaginable splendor and devastating ruin. Imagine the sprawling city of Tenochtitlan, gleaming in the sun like an untamed jewel set amidst vast, glistening lakes. But beyond its towering temples and sacred marketplaces, shadows gather. In the early 1500s, omens darkened the skies, and whispers of foreign gods drifted through the wind. The Mexica people, masters of war and artisans of culture, are poised on the brink of their greatest trial. Meet Tecuichpotzin, an 11-year-old princess with fire in her eyes, and a lineage that intertwines rival royal bloodlines. Her fate, like that of her empire, teeters on the edge. And there, at the gates of Tenochtitlan, arrive the strangers, men of steel and hunger, the Spaniards led by the ambitious Hernán Cortés. From Moctezuma II's deceptive embrace to the battle cries echoing through stone streets, we witness betrayal, alliances forged in desperation, and a battle that shakes the foundation of an empire. The mysterious Malintzin, a woman torn between worlds, becomes the voice that bridges conqueror and conquers, her words altering history with each breath. We unearth the tales of warriors like Cuauhtémoc, who would rather face death than bow, and the plight of noblewomen sent as tokens, their destinies rewritten in the blink of an eye. The Aztecs' unmatched resilience finds them constructing war canoes to reclaim their sacred waters, only for fate to deal its cruelest hand. A plague of smallpox that ravages their people before sword and fire can claim victory. Join us as we step into an era where life and death danced on obsidian blades, and loyalty, both tested and betrayed, defined what it meant to survive. This is not just history, it is the legacy of the Aztecs, an empire that dared to rise against gods and conquerors alike. Join us on the Odyssey of Empires, a journey into the past to find the soul of our forgotten world, the Aztec Empire. Early days of the Aztec Empire. The walls of the adobe houses burned slowly as the tongues of flame sought wooden beams. But the resistance of the humid mud did not effectively slow the disaster, for the thatched roofs went up in a massive blaze, and then came crashing downwards, destroying everything in the homes below. The inhabitants had emerged screaming as the mounted Spaniards set their village alight. They stood and watched as all their worldly goods crackled and disappeared. Some cried, some were too stunned to react. Everyone knew that the prior of the nearby Franciscan mission had sent the riders, who thundered off into the distance. This moment occurred in 1559 in a town located east of Mexico City. The Spaniards had been present in the town for over 30 years, yet most villagers had not given them much thought. One of the older men nearby had grown too blind to see much, but the sounds and smells told him everything. He was an aging chief, still known to his people as Chimalpopoca, Smoking Shield, like one of the Mexica kings of old. But years earlier, he had taken the official name of Don Alonso de Castañeda, after one of the first Spanish conquistadors to come to the area. Over the last 2 years, he and several other community leaders endeavored to persuade the local villagers that the Spaniards truly intended for them to abandon their rural hamlets and relocate to the larger town of Cuautinchan, where they could more effectively convert to Christianity, impose taxes, and maintain discipline. Burnout awaited those who resisted. This incident occurred in the small village of Amazoc. On this terrible day, Chimalpopoca would have pondered his life before and after the Spaniards. Many in his generation faced comparable moments of crisis, of course, but Chimalpopoca is unique in that he left us records of his experiences and even, to some extent, his thoughts. Younger men quote a few others who came of age before the arrival of the Spaniards. But Chimalpopoca orchestrated the writing of a book that survives today. The man's anguish must have been intense, for over the years, Chimalpopoca, or Don Alonso de Castañeda, had worked ever more closely with the Spaniards on the firm, understanding that if he did so, the perennial local warfare would end, and his people would cease to suffer. The burning of Amazoc was not exactly what he had in mind. He did not lose control of himself, however. He had lived many years and had a long memory. He knew the morning would bring a new day. He would try to help his people get through these times. Their children and their children's children still constituted the future of the Altepetl, regardless of what they had lost in their village. Political crises and war predated the arrival of the Spaniards, and this was not the first time Don Alonso had witnessed pain. One of his formative memories was of the murder of his father and uncle, long before the arrival of the strangers to us people here. It was a long story, and he was not averse to telling it on starlit evenings. At the invitation of other Nahuas who had already intermarried with the long-settled people of Cholula, his ancestors had come from a place far to the north. As a reward for helping the Cholulans defeat their enemies, the Cholulans allowed his people to settle on the still wild lands to the east, where eagles soared, but few lived. They even named their new home Cuautinchan, meaning home of the eagles. Most of the clans continued to intermarry with the Cholulans, but a few, living on the far reaches of their new settlements, forged closer bonds with the peoples farther east, who did not speak Nahuatl, but a language called Pinotl, its speakers Pinome. Those eastern subaltepetls were the minority voices in Cuautinchan, and they grew sick of their subordinate status. Eventually, in the second half of the 1400s, one of their chiefs formed a strategic alliance with the Mexico of Tlatelolco, urging them to intervene. The Pinome chief quickly assumed control, leading his group to seize all the other tribes' lands and demand tribute, a portion of which went to their new godfathers, the Tlatelolingans. Cotatzin, the father of Chimalpopoca, was born into a Nahuatl-speaking chiefly family that remained closely allied with Cholula. However, his family suffered when the eastern upstart formed an alliance with Mexico. A messenger, speaking with extreme courtesy, invited Cotatzin, who had only recently inherited the chieftainship of his family's set of villages, to the home of Toscocoli, the Pinome chief, who was now the paramount chief of all of Cuauhtémoc Chan, in 1510. The optimistic Cotatzin went to Toscocoli's village. It turned out to be a mistake. The murderers were already there, his son later remembered, and they strangled him. 10 years later, the ruler Tecuanitzin was dead, but not from treachery. He died of the foul disease that spread not long after the mysterious strangers arrived in the land. When he passed away, No one in Chimalpopoca's world had seen the newcomers, as the sickness had spread more quickly than the foreigners. However, gossip about them was already rife. The first concrete news the people would have heard was that strangers had formed an alliance with the people of Tlaxcala to destroy their beloved Cholula, the home of Chimalpopoca's grandmothers. The new enemy then advanced to Tenochtitlan, where they ultimately faced ejection. Word of that event spread far and wide. Cholulans celebrated Quatinchan with them. Soon after, however, a massive smallpox epidemic broke out, displacing thousands from Quatinchan, including the chief Tequanitzin. Chimalpopoca was a strong young man by then and survived the disease. In this time of trouble, he took his uncle's place and became chief of his family's villages, one of the major subaltepels of Quatinchan. Less than a year later, in 1521, word came that Tenochtitlan had fallen to the Spaniards. Like much of central Mexico, the people of Quatinchan waited tensely, wondering what this would mean for them. Only a few months prior to their arrival, the Spaniards, accompanied by their seasoned Tlaxcalan allies, guided the newcomers to all the crucial altars they needed to vanquish to ensure their triumph. These chiefs may have celebrated the fall of the Mexica, but not the arrival of the Tlaxcalans, who had brutally fought Cholula. The men of several altepetls in the region gathered together to make a stand. This was a subject upon which Chimalpopoca did not like to dwell in later years. "We were defeated," he said tersely, using a form of the verb that implied absolute destruction. "We all withdrew to the marshlands." After suffering significant losses, such as Shieldflower's father's defeat in 1299, Nahuas often sought refuge in the swamps. There, they elected emissaries to approach the Tlaxcalans and the strangers, and thus sue for peace. They had already heard that a woman from the eastern lands, who spoke their language perfectly and could communicate with strangers, accompanied their enemies. However, this did not reassure them, as their experience showed that communication did not always lead to peace. Sometimes, emissaries were simply killed. Hiding with his surviving people among the reeds, Chimalpopoca waited. The messengers reappeared. They declared that they could all go back to their homes if they consented to present an annual tribute to an overlord, a newcomer from a region known as Castile. What was the tribute? They asked. The tribute included a specific quantity of woven blankets, gold pieces, turkeys, and an ample amount of corn. Smoking Shield considered his options. Smoking Shield dispatched his emissaries back to obtain more precise measurements and determine the appropriate basket size for the corn, a quantity that both parties agreed upon. When he received clarification on the terms, he agreed. This was a tribute payment that his people could reasonably afford to make. The survivors went home to their villages. They believed they could move on after mourning their dead. They succeeded in doing so for a few years, as did most of Mexico. In the early 1520s, Tenochtitlan, the Spanish city of Mexico, and its surroundings were the storm's center. Despite Tenochtitlan being in shambles, the Spaniards continued to camp across the water in the lakeshore town of Coyoacan. Our lords, the Christians, had not yet come to settle here. A man who lived near the island's marketplace remembered later. They gave us consolation by staying for the time being in Coyoacan. The level of chaos in the early months of foreign governance was horrifying. The Spaniards could only maintain some semblance of order by ruling through the indigenous elites. In Mexico City, this meant ruling through Cuauhtémoc. When he claimed not to know the location of his forebears' gold stores, they kept him in a locked room and applied heated rods to the soles of his feet. If Tequixpotzin or Isabel, who was still a girl but was rapidly maturing into a woman, had ever harbored fear for her husband. She could only feel pity for him now. The two heard that in the beautiful towns of Texcoco and Xochimilco, the Spaniards loosed their giant dogs and even let the marshals kill some of the men when the people there denied knowing where the treasure hoards were. In Altepetl after Altepetl, the translator Malintzin was made to stand on a parapet and shout orders to bring the treasure. Then she had to watch the punishments meted out if the Spaniards judged that the orders were not obeyed. The conquerors seemed in a veritable frenzy to amass riches and generally please themselves. When not enough gold and jewels were forthcoming, they began to brand prisoners of war they had collected, undoubtedly including some of Smoking Shield's compatriots from the battle in Cuautinchan, and marched them to the coast for shipment to the Caribbean as enslaved people. The meticulous records specified that they set aside 1/5 of the profits, 5,597 pesos, as a tribute to King Charles in 1522. The Spaniards kept the prettiest captive young women for themselves, while other starving girls who had lost their families came to them willingly. At least one case involved locking a group of these girls in a building for forced prostitution. Conscience-stricken observers of the girls' treatment recounted stories back in Spain, prompting the king to issue a plea to his people in June 1523, urging them to stop abusing the native women. By then, the situation had calmed down somewhat. Cortés had begun to progress in imposing order and constructing a new political apparatus. The market at Tlatelolco reopened, and relatively normal urban life resumed. In Tenochtitlan, Cuauhtémoc, Spanish artisans were training crews of indigenous men, and the translators had to use their moral authority to ensure the crews showed up. The workers learned astonishingly quickly to construct fine examples of European Renaissance buildings. The enormous central square of Tenochtitlan became the Plaza Mayor, flanked by a newly rising cathedral and a massive government building with battlemented towers at either end. From morning to evening, one could hear the sound of hammering. By 1524, the Spaniards would be ready to relocate their operations center from Coyoacán to the City of Mexico. At the same time that urban Mexico was being dragged into building a great European-style downtown, Cortés was distributing the surrounding rural altarpieces as gifts to his followers. He did not receive official permission to do so until the end of 1523, but he began the process long before that. 14. Each conquistador received the villages of a specific altepetl or subaltepetl as an encomienda or package. This did not mean the people living there became that conquistador's chattel slaves. In exchange for spiritual and political protection, the conquistador expected tribute in goods and labor from the people for part of the year. For example, Juan Pérez de Arteaga, a conquistador who had spent long hours studying Nahuatl with Malintzin, assigned Cuautinchan as an assistant interpreter. 16. During this period, Malintzin frequently required assistance with more complex negotiations than the war had demanded. Instead of merely demanding submission and food supplies, Malintzin now had to articulate the precise nature of the Spaniards' political and economic demands, and then attempt to explain the indigenous political and economic realities to them. Often, the decision lay in determining which chief line should rule and which should retreat. Naturally, we only supported those lines that appeared sympathetic to the Spanish cause. For instance, Texcoco upheld the power of Ixtlilxochitl and reduced that of other family lines. Despite the Spaniards' dominance in these arrangements, Cortés and his colleagues never overlooked the fragile nature of the peace. There were, after all, still millions more Indians than Europeans in this vast land. In early 1524, Cortés issued a new edict insisting that all Spanish men maintain a full set of arms. Each was required to own a dagger, sword, lance, shield, helmet, and breastplate. Any man who did not acquire these goods within 6 months and then appear on command at military parades was subject to stiff fines. Those who had received encomiendas from up to 500 Indians also had to arrange to purchase either a crossbow and bolts, or, failing that, a firelock musket and enough ammunition to fire 200 times. If an encomienda contained between 500 and 1,000 Indians, the recipient had to obtain a horse. Those who received even larger encomiendas had to purchase more such goods. If an encomendero did not comply, he stood to lose his grant. Shortly after the Spanish population received this new ordinance in 1524, local indigenous leaders in Tenochtitlan summoned the newly arrived 12 apostles, 12 Franciscan missionaries tasked with initiating the proselytization of Mexico. What the Indians thought when they first had Christian doctrines preached to them has long been a matter of significant interest. Generally, Europeans have made their own assumptions without much evidence. At first, the earliest friars enthusiastically reported that the indigenous were deeply moved, and that they, the friars, had been able to baptize many thousands right away. Later, they walked back their assertions that all the Indians had truly been devout converts from the moment they were sprinkled with holy water. But the friars also remained generally confident in their overall success. They convinced the whole world that they had successfully converted Mexico to Catholicism quickly. Only in the 1990s did it become commonplace for scholars to argue that this premise was indeed false, that, in fact, the indigenous had not simply rejected generations of belief and accepted Christian teachings without question. In these more recent discussions, scholars have had to rely upon indirect evidence. For instance, if the Nahuas didn't have a word for the devil, how could they possibly have come to believe in him so immediately? The friars resorted to using the word tlacatecolotl, tlacatecolot, for a more generic devil in their proselytizing efforts. Before the conquest, people used this term to refer to a type of malicious shaman who could transform into a horned owl and fly around, casting spells and generally wreaking havoc in unsuspecting people's lives. At all costs, one should avoid encountering a tlacatecolotl at night. Despite the inferiority of these creatures compared to Lucifer, the friars chose the term because it best suited their needs. There are innumerable examples of such incommensurate cultural beliefs. 20. One historian has argued that both sides were too quick to assume they understood each other, leading to a double mistaken identity that made it very difficult for true Christianity to spread rapidly as the friars had hoped for. This is indirect evidence for indigenous psychological resistance to the imposition of a European worldview, but it is nevertheless very real. Yet a surviving source quotes the words of deeply religious Mexican men at the 1524 meeting, giving direct insight into what they initially thought. Bernardino de Sahagún, the famous Franciscan friar who spoke Nahuatl and orchestrated the production of the Florentine Codex, left a record of the exchange, which he called the Colloquies. It is, however, a somewhat problematic source. First, Sahagún was not there. He must have been working with someone else's notes. Second, there were numerous summons to the Indians. The text we have today is a set of notes purportedly taken on one day, but it likely represents a crystallization of what observers heard at several different meetings. The notes must have been taken in Spanish, and the translation back to Nahuatl should have been done years later, since no one alive in 1524 could have written so fluently. There were, in short, numerous opportunities for European editors to adjust the record. Despite these issues, the source maintains its credibility, as the quotes from both sides align with their previous assertions, and it claims the Indians said what the Spaniards didn't want. The interpreter, almost certainly Malintzin, though it could conceivably have been one of her apprentices, did her best to translate as the friars explained for hours the basic tenets of the Christian faith. When they finished, one of the indigenous leaders present stepped forward and, in the most courtly Nahuatl speech, offered a welcome to the strangers who had come from afar, thanking them for their precious words, like precious jades and curious feathers, he said, using the Mexica's favorite cultural similes. Then he transitioned to express his anguish that most of the wise men who had once ruled in this city had died, and that those who survived were inferior in knowledge and experience to their predecessors. He said it would be best to call together the wisest of the surviving priests and let them decide how to respond. That evening, the governing nobleman spoke to the priests and made the necessary arrangements. They must have insisted that they needed help. They were attempting to maintain order among their people in virtually impossible circumstances, and they could not risk making any politically inflammatory, dangerous religious statements themselves. Someone outside the political spotlight would have to defend Mexico's faith. So it was that in the morning a collection of priests from the Ancien Regime came to hear the Christians speak of their beliefs. The Franciscans readily complied with their request to hear all the previous day's statements. One of the 12, using the interpreter, repeated everything that they had said to the lords the day before. If the interpreter was growing tired, no one mentioned it. Finally, the leading Nahua priest rose and began to speak. He began, as was customary, in the most polite of tones, saying that he was overwhelmed by the honor of meeting the newcomers. But then at length, he changed direction. "You have told us that we do not know the one who gives us life and being, Lord of the heavens and earth. You also say that those we worship are not gods. This way of speaking is entirely new to us and very scandalous. This way of speaking frightens us because our forebears, who created and governed us, never spoke in such a manner. On the contrary, they taught us to honor the gods, asserting that it is through our gods that we live and exist, and that we are obligated to them. They said the gods we worship give us everything we need for physical existence. We pray to them for rain, so that the earth can grow." The priests spelled out the myriad reasons they had to be grateful to their gods, and concluded, "It would be a fickle, foolish thing for us to destroy the most ancient laws and customs left by the first inhabitants of this land." He added that if the Spaniards were so daring as to insist on destroying the old gods, they would be courting political disaster. He spoke as if he were giving friendly advice, but he conveyed a threat. "Be careful," he warned, "lest we incite the common people to rebel against us by revealing that the gods they have always revered are actually not gods at all." Eventually, he reached his climax. "All of us collectively feel that the loss of the reed mats and the thrones, political power, royal jurisdiction, is sufficient. As for our gods, we will die before giving up serving and worshipping them. This is our determination. Do with us what you will. This will serve as a reply and contradict what you have said. We have no more to say, lords." A more literal translation of his last words was, "That is all with which we return, with which we answer. Your breath, your words, O our lords." It was a typical way to end a political speech that had shifted from a courteous opening to the stark and bitter statement the speaker wanted to make. Some years later, in a different context, an upset Mexican prisoner would conclude a speech to his Spanish judges on behalf of himself and a friend. expressing the same sentiment, albeit in less flowery terms and in a commoner's style. "That is all we have to say." One of the 12 friars muttered under his breath, saying they would just have to wait for these older men to die. The young people would be better listeners. Essentially, that was the expected course of action for the Spanish. They decided they had no interest in causing a huge upheaval by tormenting these recalcitrant pagans. Indeed, they reassured themselves that the Indians were not genuinely rejecting Jesus. Some seemed quite willing to add him to their pantheon. They were simply adamant about not replacing their old gods. Waiting made the most sense. The friars concluded and continued their teachings and explanations. The 12 apostles established missions in the 4 places where the Spaniards had the greatest control: Tenochtitlan, nearby Texcoco, and Tlaxcala, and its neighbor, Huexotzinco. There they would begin to proselytize the people of Mexico more effectively, largely by working with young people. In mid-1524, the fatigued Malintzin was also getting ready to travel, but she wasn't planning to accompany the friars to any of their missions. Instead, she was to accompany Cortés overland to Honduras. Cortés learned that Cristobal de Olid, one of his captains on an exploratory mission, had established a rival government in Central America, and he vowed to eliminate him. Cortés forced Cuauhtémoc and several other indigenous lords as hostages to prevent their people from rebelling in his absence. Tecuichpotzin, however, was to stay home and guard the interests of the Mexica royal household. If Tecuichpotzin saw Malintzin during the weeks of preparation for the expedition, she must have pitied the older girl, though that was something she was not in the habit of doing. Both young women knew the trip would be futile and likely to be deadly. In the past 3 years, while Tecuichpotzin herself languished in virtual imprisonment alongside her beleaguered husband, the former concubine Malintzin, originally from a once tribute-paying land in the east, had grown startlingly powerful. In addition to being a translator, she was central to all negotiations. Cortés conceived Malintzin as soon as the acute strain of the War of Conquest ended. It was a boy, Cortés' first son, and they named him Martín, after Cortés' father. In letters to others, Cortés revealed how much he loved the child, and for a while he even considered him his heir. He did not, however, live with the boy and his mother. Malintzin had been removed from her own household, for Cortés had a Spanish wife in Cuba, and as soon as the peace was made, she traveled to Mexico to join her husband. Theirs was not, it seemed, a blissful marriage. Cortés and Doña Catalina fought in public and in private. Subsequently, upon Catalina's sudden death, rumors circulated that Cortés had strangled her, yet the crime remained unindicted and unproven. In any case, after all the years apart, Malintzin's time with her family and friends was brief, for she had a promise to Cortés to keep. For the sake of herself, her children, and her people, she would not break that promise. In a matter of days, they moved on toward their goal of Honduras. It was to be a long slog. Weeks in the dark forest turned into months. Cortés made a decision that has traumatized Mexicans to this day. He executed Cuauhtémoc in the town of Acalan, land of boats, about 50 miles inland from the Gulf Coast, at the headwaters of the River Candelaria. Accounts of what happened differ. Cortés later claimed that an indigenous informer revealed a plot hatched by the Mexica ruler. He had purportedly suggested that the Indians rise against the Spaniards amid the jungle and free themselves, then return to the Central Valley in secret to inspire a rebellion there as well. Others, including several Spaniards, believed it was all a misunderstanding. Cuauhtémoc and his companions had merely been celebrating a rumor they had heard that Cortés had finally come to his senses and was ready to turn back. Cuauhtémoc and his companions joked and expressed sentiments they might not have intended to express, such as expressing a preference for immediate death over a gradual death from starvation, leaving their bodies strewn along the cursed path. Cortés had each of the men involved undergo separate torture. Malintzin was tasked with translating the agonized words uttered by the men. When Cortés had the evidence he sought, he had Cuauhtémoc hanged from a ceiba tree, along with at least one of his cousins, the ruler of Tlatelolco, and probably one other nobleman. Was Cortés truly in a panic? And was it only the efforts of Malintzin and others to translate what they understood to have been sarcastic comments and jokes that saved at least a dozen others? Or had Cortés always planned to rid himself of these two Mexica pre-conquest rulers when he was far from Tenochtitlan, where their deaths could not cause rioting and unrest among the people? In either case, Malintzin and numerous indigenous men were forced to watch and even participate. Several indigenous texts produced later, unsurprisingly, directly and obliquely reference the event. Cortés left nothing in writing that might illuminate the situation. Indeed, no writings survived the trek. Almost no baggage did. Just as Cuauhtémoc had seemingly sarcastically predicted, a significant number of people perished along the route. When the remnants of the cavalcade emerged from the Atlantic coast's forest, they discovered that Cortés-aligned Spaniards had killed Cristobal de Olid months earlier. As it turned out, the expedition had been entirely unnecessary. The coastal Spaniards were nearly as hungry as those who had traveled overland from Mexico City. Once again, Cortés began coercing the local Indians to promise to offer tribute in the form of food and other valuable goods. He used the settlement's lone ship to send messages to the Caribbean seeking support. Soon enough, he received word in response that the power vacuum in the Mexican capital had given rise to a period of chaotic infighting among the Spaniards, which the Indians were watching with interest. Rumors of Cortés's own death had been rampant in the city. In desperate need of cash to solve his many problems, Cortés instructed his underlings to sell some local indigenous people into slavery in the Caribbean. He insisted they sell only those enslaved by other indigenous peoples before the conquest to avoid blame. They asked the indigenous people to identify them in Spanish without making arrangements for a translator. Malintzin would have learned of these plans around the time she gave birth to Jaramillo's child, roughly 9 months after their arrival on the Atlantic shores. This time, she had a girl named Maria, after the Virgin. Shortly afterward, they embarked for Veracruz. From there, they would head for the capital. Other departing boats carried human cargo branded for sale in the Caribbean. Such, Malintzin knew, could easily have been her fate or her daughter's. If she had ever harbored any doubts about her course of action, this would have convinced her that she had made the right decisions in her life, given her limited options. Her baby daughter, if she lived, was one girl who would never be sold as an enslaved person, either by the Mexicans or the Europeans. Meanwhile, the post-conquest political storms in Tenochtitlan continued to rage. Once returned to the city, Cortés struggled to regain his former power. Others had taken control of his lands and encomienda Indians, leading the interim government to believe the rumors of his death. One of his first acts was to officially inform Tecuichpotzin, now Lady Isabel, of the death of her husband, Cuauhtémoc. Then he brokered a marriage between her and Alonso de Grado, another conquistador. He gave de Grado the office Protector of Indians, which was rather ironic, given that de Grado had been known for brutalities toward Indians during the conquest, and he provided Isabel the large encomienda of Tlacopan. one of the three cities of the so-called Aztec Triple Alliance, where she had maternal relatives. The couple would thus be both rich and powerful. Cortés considered pleasing the indigenous nobility and the Spanish crown, and gaining a loyal and wealthy supporter in de Grado. However, a year and a half later, in early 1528, the elderly de Grado passed away. Cortés felt ever more besieged by his enemies and detractors. It was uncertain whether the king would ultimately side with him or punish him for having caused the tumult in the first place by decamping to Honduras to continue his adventures. "I am in purgatory," Cortés agonized to his father. "The only reason it's not hell is because I still hope for redress." In his desperation, Cortés grew ever more rebellious and even reckless. When de Grado died, Cortés told the lovely 18-year-old daughter of Moctezuma that because she was a wealthy, highly desirable widow, he would move her into his own household for her own protection. He was already in the habit of telling the Spanish world that Moctezuma, on his deathbed, struck down by rocks thrown by his own people, according to Cortés, had tearfully asked Cortés to protect his daughters. 35. Posing in front of Isabel as her protector was slightly more fantastical. Isabel really had no choice. Her friends and family in the indigenous world could not afford to confront Cortés. Perhaps she believed his promises that she would be safe with him. Cortés took her and her few worldly goods to his home. Once there, she had no defenses. A close friend of Cortés once commented laconically that he had no more conscience than a dog. Isabel became pregnant almost immediately. Cortés traveled to Spain to speak directly with the king about his affairs. He would take along young Martín, his son by Malintzin, and legitimize the child by the Pope, in case he never pursued other male children. Then, he would leave Martín in Spain as a page to the young Prince Philip. Before he left, he needed to solve the awkward problem of Isabel's pregnancy. He never would have considered marrying her himself. Not only did he harbor a dream of marrying a Spanish noblewoman, but he also had another motivation. Isabel was an indigenous woman whose social position might have prompted Cortés to consider marriage. But her high status meant that marrying her would fuel rumors that Cortés was trying to establish a fiefdom in Mexico. He could easily alienate the king. Pedro Gallego de Andrade, a follower of Cortés, stated that he had no objections to marrying Isabel in her present condition, provided she still kept the extensive encomienda of Tlacopan, which Cortés assured him she would. Indeed, the Spanish government valued Isabel's possession of the extensive encomienda of Tlacopan, as it symbolized the Spaniards' recognition of the Mexica royal family and their acceptance of Spanish legal jurisdiction over themselves and their people. Cortés saw Isabel married to Gallego, and then he and his young son sailed away. 4 months later, Isabel faced childbirth, what she thought of as my moment of death. There were Nahua women among her servants who were fortunate at this time of pain and uncertainty. "Beloved daughter," they would have comforted her in her own language, "exert yourself. How should we treat you? Here are your old mothers. This is your responsibility. Grab hold of the shield. My daughter, a young one, is a brave woman. Face it. Bear down. Imitate the brave goddess Tzihua-Coatl." All her life, Isabel Tecuichpotzin had thought of a woman giving birth as a warrior who could win honor, not as someone who begged for mercy in the face of a great punishment inflicted by the deity, as the Spaniards did. But in her case, pride did not accompany whatever courage she showed. She was not capturing a spirit and bringing it home to her family to carry on their traditions. One of Cortés's cousins, who had promised to raise the child for him, took the newborn girl from her. In her misery, Isabel found, to her surprise, that her husband, Pedro Gallego, was kind to her and sympathized with her, and she came to value him. The next year she bore him a son named Juan. They held a wonderful baptismal party in honor of Moctezuma's first grandson, who was born in Christian matrimony and was a child who would enter the Spanish world. Church bells rang, and the people lit bonfires to celebrate. 2 months after the baby's birth, Pedro Gallego died suddenly, and Isabel seemed devastated. She turned even more fully to the child. All her life she loved Juan best among her children. Her next marriage to a Spaniard named Juan Cano lasted more than 20 years and seemed happy, but her other children never displaced Juan. Isabel, always known as Tequich by the indigenous city folk 42, was known for her quiet demeanor. She was never entirely comfortable with the symbolic role the Spaniards had carved out for her. She gave as many profits from her encomienda as possible to a favored Augustinian friary. She suggested to both of her daughters that they could become nuns instead of marrying Spanish men, a decision they eventually made. In her will, she freed all the enslaved Indians who served in her husband's household. We can't know if she envied her sister, christened Francisca, the one who had not been presented to the Spaniards as an emissary wife, but was instead sent to her mother's birthplace, in the countryside of Ecatepec, near Azcapotzalco. The Spaniards never even knew about this royal daughter in the early years. Her fate more closely resembled that of the majority of indigenous people, who lived their lives beyond the direct observation of the Spaniards. Unlike Malintzin and Tequich, the majority did not initially become entangled in the chaos. As the Spaniards fanned out in the countryside, however, every community eventually faced its moment of crisis. When Malintzin finally succumbed to one of the European microbes and died, 44 in 1529, Cuauhtinchan faced a similar crisis in 1530, as Isabel sang Nahuatl lullabies to her newborn. Smoking Shield guided his people through most of the 1520s without major incidents. The Spaniards built a little church in the neighboring town of Tepeaca, and a priest visited as often as he could. He told the Cuauhtinchan people to attend Mass in Tepeaca, but few did, and no one caused trouble. The requisite tribute gradually became more of a problem as it increased over time, and Smoking Shield was convinced there would be trouble if they ignored that mandate as well. Cuauhtinchan pledged to provide 24,000 woven blankets every 4 years, along with 20 turkeys, 6,000 bushels of corn, 16 baskets of beans, 80 chilies, 16 chia, and 16 salts by the decade's end. In addition, 30 Indians had to provide domestic services to the encomenders and various Spanish officials. They could rotate that duty among themselves in any way they liked, as long as non-disabled workers presented themselves to the right people at the right time. The tasks were growing more onerous than the town could handle, especially in the wake of so many deaths from the new diseases. Planting and harvesting their own crops was becoming increasingly challenging, leading to their children's starvation and increased susceptibility to disease. Many armed Spaniards arrived in the region and set up camp, forcing Smoking Shield to abandon his dreams of becoming a renegade. It was 1529, and Nuño Beltrán de Guzmán, who would soon launch a war of conquest in the west of Mexico, had just been named to preside over the governing high court in Tenochtitlan. Cortés was absent in Spain, and the king's representative, the viceroy, remained uncertain. In the meantime, Guzmán was in charge. He decided to arrest Ixtlilxochitl, the Texcocan nobleman whose family line had benefited from the arrival of the Spaniards. Throughout the 1520s, he had made the most of his alliance with Cortés and waged war against his neighbors when necessary. A Franciscan monastery now deposited Ixtlilxochitl in a dungeon cell, where he lived and died. 48. Next, Guzman sent his henchmen out into the countryside east of the city, with instructions to conscript several thousand indigenous warriors for the military campaign he was planning. In Cuautinchan, the Spaniards demanded that the local nobles attend a meeting, and through an interpreter, they made it clear that only those who immediately converted to Christianity and promised to cooperate would be able to retain their seats. Although Smoking Shield did not mention the matter in the book of history he later wrote, other sources reveal that the local chiefs decided to accept baptism at that time. He accepted a man in the Spaniards' company named Alonso de Castañeda as his patron and godfather. Chimalpopoca, now Alonso, bowed his head. A priest splashed water on him and his fellows, praying as he did so and turning them all into namesakes of Spaniards. Smoking Shield excelled as a performer and skilled negotiator, preventing the conscription of most of his men as the Spanish force advanced. Their population was not devastated. He led his people to church and attempted to appear interested, understanding that this was crucial if he wanted the Spaniards to treat his people respectfully. One of his contacts recalled, "But no one knew yet what was happening if it was Sunday or some other day in the new calendar. We were really new at it. We didn't know what was going on." Since Christianity arrived, noblemen felt pressure to choose only one wife from their many, as if they would expel the others. They could initially ignore the hints and requests, but it wasn't clear how long. The authors of the next generation's annals cautiously discussed the topic of conjugal cords, providing no specific details. The whole subject was extraordinarily painful, not only for the potentially rejected women, but also for their children. In the long run, only generational change brought the noblemen to monogamy. In the meantime, there were more public issues to contend with. In 1531, two bedraggled and exhausted chiefs appeared in Cuautinchan, begging for succor. They were the leaders of 19 families who had fled desperate situations. Their former chiefs had apparently been less effective than Smoking Shield at staving off the effects of conquest by the Spaniards. Perhaps they had simply been unlucky. The people came from different backgrounds. Some were not even Nahuas but Otomi and Pinome. But in their mutual need, they had come together under the leadership of two charismatic men named Elohuehue, Elowewe, and Apiancatl, Api-an-Cat, who had promised to try to care for them all. Old Man Like a Fresh Ear of Corn meant the first man's name, while Apiancatl was a stylized traditional title that once conveyed authority but has since lost meaning. They were suffering people from distant lands, Smoking Shield remembered. According to custom, all the Cuautinchan leaders came together to decide what to do. They agreed to offer the newcomers some unoccupied lands at the start of the road to Tepeaca. Like in the past, multiple parties repeated formal public statements to make these arrangements permanent. Then, a designated person painted a representation of the agreement, using known symbols for water, hills, and roads to indicate the boundaries of the land. To this, the people added another ingredient. They brought with them to the meeting a young man who had learned the Roman letters from one of the Christians, and he wrote out the statements they made using symbols that he manipulated adeptly. Smoking Shield used his Nahuatl name, but he added Alonso de Castañeda, and included a title that the Spaniards had told him indicated he was a nobleman. So he became Don Alonso de Castañeda Chimalpopoca. Don Alonso and the other chiefs explained to the newcomers that to render the agreement binding in the eyes of the Christian authorities, the people needed to build a thatch-roofed temple where they could honor the Christian God. A priest would soon come from Tepeaca to bless their endeavor. The grateful settlers called their new village Amazoc and promised themselves they would never abandon it. Their resolve was to cost them dearly when the Franciscans later ordered everybody to leave the countryside and move to Cuautinchan. In 1558, the stubbornly devoted people of Amazoc lost their homes due to fire. However, all of that was still a distant prospect. Don Alonso was facing another crisis at the time. In early 1532, the Spaniards accused a fellow Cuautinchan chief, Huaylacapitzin, or Heart of a Snail Shell, of practicing human offering and execution. Only recently did Don Alonso join him at the meeting, where the settlers of Amazoc received land gifts. Huaylacapitzin used his Nahuatl, a new Spanish name, Don Tomas. On the surface, he appeared to be adapting to the new ways, similar to Smoking Shield, but this was evidently not the case behind the scenes. He was the heir of the prominent Pinome dynasty, belonging to the same family that had orchestrated the murder of Smoking Shield's father approximately 2 decades prior. However, Smoking Shield did not seem to hold this fact against him, especially since they had fought together in their unsuccessful attempt to defend Cuautinchan from outsiders. When Smoking Shield spoke of Heart of a Snail Shell, he used the Nahuatl honorific Tzin at the end of his name, which he withheld from the man who had actually ordered his father killed. He attempted to completely avoid discussing the events of 1532, but in later years, when he was narrating his people's history, a questioner seemingly compelled him to revisit that moment and address the matter as it now appears as an insert. He spoke concisely, stating that Don Tomas met his demise that year. The only way his children could learn more was to ask someone involved. It turned out that a young Tlaxcalan aide to the Spanish friars had informed the representatives of the new religion about what was happening. The Franciscans arrested Heart of a Snail Shell, whom they persistently called Tomas, tried him, and sentenced him to death. The Franciscans ordered the nobility of all the subalterpetls of Cuautinchan and other neighboring towns to attend the hanging, and the images of what they saw that day remained burned into their memories. The man kicked his legs until he expelled all life from his body. Even then, one who mourned him did not give up hope. His dog, white with black spots, stayed lying there beside his hanged master. Then they hanged 2 other men, presumably native priests, suspected of assisting Tomas, and quartered their bodies. Finally, they tied up the men and women who were allegedly present at the sacrificial ceremony to shame them under the hot sun. Even Smoking Shield and other neighbors of Don Tomas and his people probably did not know exactly what had transpired. Each village, or close-knit set of villages, struggled to make sense of the new religion and decide how to comply with the authorities' expectations without disrespecting the ancient gods. Rumors swirled through the countryside of varying activities and varying Spanish responses. Don Tomas Huaylacapitzin was not the only indigenous lord in Mexico facing a death sentence due to accusations of spiritual crimes. Many still held rituals honoring the old gods. In this environment, Smoking Shield Don Alonso received instructions that he and his people were to participate in building a stone church in Cuautinchan. They enthusiastically tackled the project, determined to take pride in their work. The church would compete with Tepeaca, a nearby town and long-standing rival. Juan de Rivas, a friar, clarified that the structure should not resemble ancient temples' pyramidal mountains, but rather resemble a large cube with a tower emerging from it. The people painted the insides with swirling flowers, placing a jaguar and an eagle in prominent positions. These were the characters of the ancient Nahua story, the ordinary animals who bravely jumped into the fire at the creation of the fifth sun, and who had symbolized the qualities of warriors ever since. One of the friars conducted Cristobal, a son, or perhaps a young cousin, of Don Alonso, named after an Old World saint, a Canaanite who converted to Christianity and helped travelers cross a river, along with a passel of other boys, to the Franciscan establishment at Tlatelolco. He had his most precious possessions packed in a wooden chest with a lock, key, and a rolled-up mat for sleeping. When the boys arrived, they were told to place their belongings in the long dormitory chamber and were given something to eat in the dormitory. In the coming weeks and months, Cristobal apparently found the lessons to his liking. The friars showed them a cartilla, or letter primer, which the religious men had copied out themselves. Later, they would have copies of the little textbook printed up, and the boys rapidly learned the sounds associated with the symbols: ba-baby bobu, bam-bem bim bom boon, fa-fe-fi fo-fu, fam-fem-fem from fam. Several of them had been reading the new phonetic code for weeks. Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, the teacher, assured the exceptional students that they could start studying Latin if they persevered. Then they could access all the knowledge of the ancient world. He showed them the venerable books kept in the school library and promised them the keys to that kingdom. The drawing master hurt the group by speaking scathingly of the paintings their forebears had done, but in the eyes of some of the boys, he made it up to them when he taught them how to introduce perspective. They were soon entertaining themselves by drawing true-to-life animals: dogs, birds, and horses. Christian theology was much easier for Cristobal than his elders had thought. His teacher's deep commitment to the doctrines convinced him that the material was just as valuable as the religious lessons he had learned at home. When the boys united in song to express gratitude to God, he experienced a transcendent experience, hearing the divine's music. Of course, school wasn't always so uplifting. Some friars understood and punished Nahuatl's arguments and raunchy jokes, surprising the students. Sometimes their teachers entertained themselves by gossiping about European politics. Henry VIII, the King of England, had lost control of his passions only a few years earlier and set aside his Christian wife, Catherine, daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabel, in favor of a young English woman, Anne Boleyn. Shameless, the friars called her. Now came the news that, having grown sick of Anne Boleyn, Henry had had her imprisoned and then beheaded. All of this he had done to prove that he could break away from the Roman Catholic authority of the Pope. As a king, Henry had set a terrible example, something the teachers hoped their own students would never do when they grew up to become chiefs. At times, the teachers emphasized that their students should not emulate the behavior of English monarchs or their ancestors. Their later writings do not clarify whether the idea that European politics sometimes resembled their own shamed or heartened the students. When Cristobal returned home a few years later, he had become a fluent writer, a master of beautiful handwriting, and an expert in grammar and punctuation. 64. He prayed to the Christian God and dressed in Spanish clothing. Unsurprisingly, he became embroiled in the conflict between families who chose to educate their sons in Spanish and those who did not. A relative wrote a sly comment in Spanish in the margins of a book. Well-born noblemen who do not know their letters have no understanding. They are noble beasts. 65. People often referred to useful tamed animals as noble beasts, deserving of humanity's sympathy and kindness, but referring to indigenous noblemen as noble beasts was, in reality, a vicious insult. It was an even harsher insult than referring to them as mere animals. It was a pun, as bestia, beast also meant stupid. Thus the phrase could mean noble beasts. However, the phrase could also refer to stupid noble men. At times, these tensions manifest not only between families, but also within them and between generations. Young Don Felipe de Mendoza, from one of the Pinomi lineages, a connection of the hanged Don Tomas, was invited, without his respected father, to another nobleman's house, specifically because he was, like his host, raised afterward and educated in the church. 66. The fact that only he was welcomed, not the elders in his family, appears to have caused young Felipe pain, as he remembers the words and repeats them later. Before long, the agonies caused by these social rifts gave way to a much larger crisis. It had been over 20 years since the terrible epidemic of 1520, and now a new generation had arisen that lacked immunities. Then, in 1544, worms ate the corn crop, and people starved. In 1545, the most terrible epidemic since the conquest devastated the land. Cristobal and his father must have lost family members. Everyone did. But no record of the names of their dead has survived. Many lands on the outskirts of Cuautinchan lay fallow, and the villagers assigned to work them were either dying or dead. Consequently, the people of Tepeaca, a populous town, decided to move in and settle in those areas. They were old enemies, and rage smote Smoking Shield. Part of him wanted to go by night, attack the intruders, and drive them away as he once would have. But that era was past. Now he was Don Alonso de Castañeda. In March 1546, instead of launching a war, he and his fellow chiefs decided to make the most of their son's new literacy style. They would sue the people of Tepeaca in a Spanish court of law. The Mexican overlords, who had been arbiters in their local affairs for many years, easily understood this concept. Don Alonso and his entourage made their way to Mexico City. Old pre-conquest roads led to the city they still called Tenochtitlan. These paths were familiar to chiefs, but the terrain seemed strange in other ways. The fear of attacks from perceived enemies no longer plagued travelers. Thieves were always around, but no one expected travelers to bring war. They reached the valley's center and crossed the lake to the island city. Although the outskirts of the town still belonged to indigenous fishermen and Chinampa farmers, new Spanish-style buildings rose everywhere in the bustling downtown area. Don Alonso's small group traveled to Tlatelolco, a place they knew from their son's school days. They found suitable accommodations, but quickly realized they would need to spend significant money to sustain themselves in the city. However, they weren't going to back down now. They persevered in their case, resolute in their determination to stay until they had sufficiently handled the business to trust it to a representative. The court was their regular stop from May to August 1546. The towering stone walls and the darkness within intimidated them when they entered the first time, but they soon grew accustomed to it. That first day, the leader of Cuautinchan's indigenous governing cabildo, or council, spoke for the group, but Don Alonso's personality was so much more forceful that he soon took over. In their records, the Spaniards referred simply to Don Alonso and the other nobles. He insisted on the appearance of certain witnesses from Tepeaca and coordinated their presentation. Once the court interpreter had transcribed each witness's words, he would ask them to read the statement back to him and then nod his assent. Don Alonso was eagerly absorbing lessons about the European world. This city of Mexico, whatever else it was a place of grandeur and a center of visible power. In the chambers of the High Court, he witnessed the exercise of power within the world that the Europeans were creating. Just as in his world, power was wielded through statements made publicly, gravely, and with ritualistic language, then commemorated on paper. But he also noted a significant difference. In this context, a specific type of writing solidified decisions. This was not the pictographic writing that he knew so well, but which younger men in his world could no longer read easily. He was observing the process of alphabetic writing and phonetic transcription of spoken language. These markings on paper encoded the human voice. In court, the judge smoothly read back his exact words. Young men like Cristobal assured him that anyone could learn to interpret the sounds of the letters. They were not the special province of priests who spent decades memorizing hundreds of pictorial to graphic symbols and creating others, taking much of their knowledge to the grave. Even if a terrible epidemic were to strike dead all the specially trained men of the High Court tomorrow, others could read these documents fully. It would be possible for men to hear his exact words generations later. That was certainly worth thinking about. In August, Don Alonso was ready to leave the lawsuit in the hands of a lawyer and return home with his entourage. He then focused on a new project, deciding to orchestrate the writing of a significant piece of his people's history using the new letters. In some ways, the book he had in mind would look like a collection of old-style painted documents, representing important historical moments and establishing the boundaries to various ancient lands, with glyphs and drawings. However, in other aspects, the book would differ significantly, as it would chronicle the history of his people verbally, year by year. All that was once said out loud around the communal fire would be written down and transcribed using the new letters. He could receive assistance from his son and other young people. His generation would supply the necessary information, while the younger generation would contribute through writing. They could work on the visual elements together. It would be a historical account of all the Tolteca Chichimeca, specifically focusing on those who eventually settled in Cuautinchan. Over the years, Don Alonso envisioned concrete uses for the volume, such as providing evidence in Spanish courtrooms regarding traditional landholding arrangements or carrying it to indigenous ceremonies as a sacred object to lend authenticity to the procedures. But Don Alonso dedicated untold hours of his family's time to this project for deeper reasons than these. He foresaw that once his people's memory of the meaning of the glyphs had faded and their communities had sunk into the poverty that Spanish demands were pushing them toward, narrowing their horizons and forcing them to focus on survival. A severe social amnesia would ensue. How could they demand their future if they couldn't remember their past? Cristobal picked up the quill, ready to write, and Don Alonso de Castañeda Chimalpopoca began to speak. He told an ancient tale about the breakup of a joyful community centuries earlier. His people have told this story for many years, since they were nomads. When Humac became a young man, he ordered the Nonohualca to tend to his home. Then the Nonohualca said to him, "So be it, my lord. May we do what you desire." The Nonohualca came to tend to his home, and then he demanded women out of them. He said to the Nonohualca, "You are to give me women." He commanded that the buttocks should be 4 spans wide. Undoubtedly, Alonso paused to ridicule the man's absurd conceit. But then he would have faced the cultural divide that was beginning to form between him and his descendants. Was young Cristobal's Nahuatl still sufficient for him to understand the joke? Did Don Alonso need to clarify everything to the younger man who had grown up in a different era? Did he explain to the younger man that the story was particularly rich because Humac meant big gift? He had been a foundling and was supposedly a gift from the gods. Some big gift, he turned out to be. It was because of him that the original discord between the ancestors arose. Hjömak, indeed. He had been no gift, but he certainly had brought the unexpected. Like so much of life, Don Alonso must have thought, as one who had seen one world give way to another and had survived with his humor intact. He was living proof that the new world he and his people found themselves in would not obliterate the old one. Later, when the houses of Amazoc burned, Don Alonso de Castañeda Chimalpopoca would be ready to comfort the afflicted. It had long been a Nahua leader's role to shoulder responsibilities on behalf of the people. He would not shirk his duty. He was resolute in ensuring his people's survival during these challenging times. The Mega Aztec. War that ends all wars. The air was foul with the stench of the burning bodies, the stench of the Micatzintli, the poor dead woman who had lain motionless for days, was even more repulsive. She did not move. No palace official was strong enough to handle the situation. Shortly after, the unwanted strangers were forced to leave Tenochtitlan. A sickness unlike any other had struck. On the dirty sleeping mats next to her, Moctezuma's little daughter looked at her sisters. They remained alive. Their dark eyes mirrored her fear as they turned to face her. Disgusting sores covered their faces, arms, and entire bodies. However, they were starting to recover. They didn't appear to be near death. The word was the same, but different. When she thought she knew they were all dying and vanishing in the fevered haze. Up until now, none of the royal children had experienced hunger daily. Their excellent fortune helped them survive, and their servants cared for them despite the scourge. Their maturity also contributed to their survival. Later, Moctezuma's daughter would discover that her younger siblings, who were the newest wives' children, had passed away. Their disappearance wasn't unique. Weeks before the pox outbreak, she described the erasure of others. On the night of the Spaniards' expulsion, the strangers saved her, unintentionally killing 2 of her brothers in the process. The Spaniards found her father, Lord Moctezuma himself, strangled like a typical criminal. Most likely it was accurate. But it had come to pass. He and the others were no longer in sight. They would never return, much like the heroes depicted in the songs. The singers always said that life on earth was short. When people passed away, the singers cried, "Are we born twice on this earth?" The child now understood the meaning of the chorus, responding with a tragic, irate, and tearful "no." Tecuichpotzin, also known as the lordly daughter, Tecuichpotzin, was approximately 11 years old. Her mind probably ignored some of the horrors she had experienced over the past year, relying instead on her remaining cunning to get by daily. Driving the Spaniards from the smouldering, bitter city and forcing them to escape was a happy moment. If she had known that the worst was yet to come, and that the ordeal was far from over, she might not have felt strong enough to continue and help her people rebuild their world. Despite having her cherished sisters by her side, she was only 11 and had a child's enthusiasm for life. Naturally, she was unaware that the illness was relentlessly pursuing them. So, like all the other women, she grabbed a broom and started sweeping after the Spanish left. 6. She cleared the door of the metaphorical and actual cobwebs. Tecuichpotzin would have responded that the issues had begun before the strangers and their Tlaxcalan allies entered her world through the causeway. Her father had been struggling to decide what to do for months, and his temper had been strained. The consequences of fighting the newcomers so close to home in front of their allies were too severe for him to handle. No matter how grand or sincere his tributes were, they didn't stop the army. He finally concluded that all he could do was welcome them, act as though he was expecting them, and gather as much information as possible. Tensions had existed since the first moments of their arrival, when Hernando Cortés got off his horse, stepped forward a few paces, and appeared to embrace Moctezuma. The astonished retainers of the Tlatoani had promptly intervened to stop such blatant disrespect. They eagerly anticipated the gift-giving. Cortés displayed a cut glass and pearl necklace. Moctezuma indicated that a servant had produced a necklace of red snail shells adorned with exquisitely crafted gold shrimp. He then told the new arrivals to follow him while he conversed with the leaders inside. The precise words spoken between the legendary men are unknown to us. Few people, including Tecuichpotzin, heard what went back and forth between them. A year later, Cortés made the astounding assertion that Moctezuma had gladly and instantly ceded his kingdom to the newcomers, because he and his people had long anticipated that his descendants would return and reclaim it after an ancestor had passed away generations earlier. Cortés went on to say that a few days later, unsure of his complete authority, he put Moctezuma under house arrest and never let him go again. Although Cortés's claims may appear completely enigmatic, they were necessary for him to make at the time. When Cortés wrote about these events a year later, the Mexicans had driven him and his entire army out of the city. He then made a valiant attempt to plan a coastal conquest with the help of native allies and recently arrived Spaniards. He wanted to appear as a faithful servant to the Spanish monarch, who had already achieved enormous things and would soon accomplish even more rather than as a loser. Under Spanish law, he could only declare war in the king's name if attempting to retake a rebelled territory. He had no right to incite unrest by declaring war on a foreign nation that had just expelled him. The Mexican people had originally accepted Spanish rule, so realizing their current decisions were interpreted as acts of rebellion was important. Cortés's men frequently provided accurate accounts of these incidents in their subsequent writings. The great Moctezuma continued to show his accustomed goodwill toward us. Cortés tried to dissuade him, but met with no success. Towards the middle of the paragraph, another man appeared to recall that Moctezuma had been their prisoner. While I stayed, I did not see a living creature killed. They brought a wide range of bread varieties. His people brought him various river and sea fish and fruit from the seacoast and the highlands. He probably had a wonderful table service of gold and silver, but was not served on either since he was in captivity. It is more than likely that Cortés had heard about the Mexica history of schisms and migrations through Malintzin, or perhaps others. Moctezuma knew his ancestors were invaders, and successive waves had moved on or turned back. It would make sense for him to believe, or at least seem to believe in front of his people, that the strangers were other descendants of his own fearsome ancestors. In short, these visitors were long-lost relatives whose existence did not surprise him at all. Such a scenario makes perfect sense. The first conference of Mexicatlatoani and European men is unknown. The only thing the children of the indigenous elites ever mentioned was that Moctezuma recounted his own ancestral lineage in great detail, before referring to himself as the newcomer's poor vassal. If he made such a statement, he merely showcased his immense power in the speech of reversal, considered the pinnacle of politeness in the Nahua world. It certainly would not have indicated that he intended to relinquish his throne without further action. In the weeks and months that followed, Moctezuma remained in power, and despite the drain on his resources that came with feeding such a company, he treated the strangers, even the Tlaxcalan leaders, like honored guests, questioning them repeatedly through Malintzin. The Spaniards toured the city, rudely demanding gifts everywhere they went. And when their hosts saw Moctezuma's personal storehouse and told them they could take whatever they wanted, they slapped each other on the back and laughed. The Tlaxcalan warlords preferred polished jade, while the Spaniards melted beautiful gold jewelry to make bricks. Moctezuma showed the strangers maps and tribute lists to get them to name their price and leave, hoping he would have established the best possible relationship with them by the time they did. Moctezuma sent Tekushpotzin and 2 of her sisters to the newcomers as potential brides, a telling gesture. It was a test. The strangers treating them as concubines rather than brides would be bad, but he would know where he stood. The royal sisters, presented in all their finery, kept their eyes down and maintained a respectful silence as their elders made the requisite rhetorical speeches and Malintzin listened. The translator learned that Moctezuma had several older daughters already married into the royal houses of Chalco, Culhuacan, Tlacopan, and other important altepetls. These 3 daughters were currently of marriageable age. The mother of 2 was the daughter of the Chihuacoatl, the leading military commander. The mother of Tecuichpotzin, or lordly daughter, was a daughter of the former king Ahuitzotl. So this child's marriage was of immense political significance, as her heritage brought together both the rival branches of the royal family, the one descended from Huitzilihuitl, and the one descended from Itzcoatl. Moctezuma kept the existence of her younger sister a secret from the Spaniards, so they did not even know of her until years later. Perhaps Moctezuma believed she could serve as a political pawn in the future, or perhaps her Tepanek mother had insisted on keeping the girl hidden. The Spaniards purposefully concealed another young boy, the child of a Teotihuacan woman. There is no written record of what happened in the former palace of Axayacatl, but some of the Spaniards later claimed that Cortés had assaulted several princesses during those early years, and they would never have held other, less prominent figures accountable for their actions. Malintzin explained to the strangers, who were completely unaware of the intricate politics of marriage in this part of the world, that Tecuichpotzin was the daughter of a high-ranking mother, and, therefore, a princess of significance. They baptized her and named her Isabel after Queen Isabella, who had sent the first ships to the New World. After weeks of stress, things took a drastic turn in April 1520, when Moctezuma received word from his network of messengers that at least 800 more Spaniards in 13 ships had arrived on the coast. The Spaniards were unaware of this until the Tlatoani decided to inform them of their reaction. He passed the information to Malintzin, who then turned to Jerónimo de Aguilar, who spoke the words out loud in Spanish. Cortés was unable to conceal his panic at that moment. When Alonso de Puertocarrero, a Chaylarudan May, Pereisocel from Veracruz, the plan had been to make straight for Spain, but one of the Spaniards on board had lands and loved ones on the north coast of Cuba. Stopping briefly at his plantation had proven irresistible. They left within just a few days, but word soon spread. It took little convincing to get many altepetls, or certain genera of altepetls, to associate with the unknown. These family lines and their supporters were prepared and eager to engage in combat with the strong newcomers because of long-standing internal conflicts. In Texcoco, for example, Huexotzincatzin had been imprisoned for singing with the Lady of Tula, and Moctezuma had only recently worked to remove unwanted heirs to the throne, to make room for his nephew, Cacama. Several of Huexotzincatzin full brothers had taken land bribes. However, the Altepetl split in two following the old king's death, Nezahualpilli, only a few years prior. The youngest brothers of Huexotzincatzin, the executed poet heir, seized control of the northern half of the realm. One of these younger brothers, Ixtlilxochitl, Ixtlilxochit, was a highly successful warrior who chose to seize the opportunity and ally with strangers. His goal was to drive out Moctezuma's favorite, Cacama, and bring Texcoco under the authority of his full brothers and himself. Thousands of Texcocans were soon fighting on the side of the Spaniards because of Ixtlilxochitl's efforts. Cortés was thrilled with him, describing him as a very valiant youth of 23 or 24 years, who worked hard to bring along many chiefs and brothers of his. He acknowledged that the brothers were not so firm in their friendship as they afterward became. While they awaited reinforcements, the Spanish forces sought to forge alliances with the local populace. The Tlaxcalans learned how to construct brigantines to sail on the Great Lake from Martin López, a shipbuilder in their company. Weavers, carpenters, rope makers, and canoeists were needed. When appropriate, they transported the 12 separate boats they had constructed in fragments to the shores of the massive lake and put them together there. The Tlaxcalans rapidly mastered navigating the big, swift boats and working the sails. Some later wrote the conquest down in their early chronicles and told their children about it. It became a significant, enduring memory and was an empowering, even exhilarating experience. Cortés and his troops would never again rely on the causeways shortly. Tenochtitlan lived in constant fear in Tenochtitlan. Soon after her rescue, the terrible disease struck, making her relief at the epidemic's abatement even more fleeting than her joy at saving herself from the strangers and watching them flee. After only about 80 days in power, Cuitlahuac, the new Tlatoani, and her father's younger brother had passed away from smallpox. Every family in the city lay in ruins, unable to grieve for their ruler as their faith dictated. The people managed daily efforts to rebuild and regain strength as best they could. In the meantime, the council elected Cuauhtemoc as the new Tlatoani. He was a descendant of Itzcoatl, a son of the former king Ahuitzotl, and belonged to the other branch of the family. He was supported by Tlatelolco, because his mother was Tlatelolcan. Many locals continued to bring their produce, because the Tlatelolcans controlled the large market on the island's north side, and they were very strong during these turbulent times. Tenochtitlan initially believed Cuauhtemoc's election was appropriate, but a new horror struck with full force within weeks. Cuauhtemoc and his advisors knew the situation in the Mexican countryside even after their July victory, as people from across the country were still considering alliances with strangers. Because the plague struck everyone in the nation at once, including the Spanish allies and possible allies, Mexico was comparatively unafraid of an attack during the outbreak. However, as the survivors recovered and regained their full strength, Mexico began to worry that the fighting season would soon return. They would most likely be destroyed if they could not stop most nearby altars from becoming deviant. Cuauhtemoc thought that using violent force was the only way to respond. Moctezuma's remaining sons posed a threat to Cuauhtemoc and his policies. While some remained alive, the fighting on the night of the Spanish retreat had claimed the lives of 2. The majority of Tenochca likely backed the sons of Moctezuma, while the majority of Tlatelolcans backed Cuauhtemoc. More significantly, Moctezuma, their father, would have taught these sons that open conflict with these foreigners was pointless and ineffective. As a result, they stood for a different way of thinking. They provided an alternative to the conflict the city was fighting. Luckily for Cuauhtemoc, their weakness enabled him to depict these Moctezuma sons as feeble and symbolic of past transgressions. Cuauhtemoc described them in this manner. After that, he quickly had 6 of them killed, Some even claimed he used his bare hands to kill one. Tequechpotzin's only full brother, named Axayacatsin after the previous king, was among those who died. The Tlatelolcan noblemen, who regarded Cuauhtémoc as completely innocent, explained, "The reason these nobles were killed is that they were favoring the common people in desiring peace and trying to see to it that shelled white maize, turkey hens, and eggs should be collected so that they could have them submit to the Spaniards." Tequechpotzin had only 2 half-brothers left, little boys who had escaped the pox and were too young to be a danger. Cuauhtémoc pursued lordly daughter Tequechpotzin herself amid the chaos, but he didn't want to murder her. Rather, he desired to wed her and force her to become the mother of his children. Because his heirs would have connections to both branches of the royal family, he was able to legitimize his rule in the eyes of a much wider audience. The union maintained the tradition of having a new Tlatoani from a different family branch marry a daughter or another close relative of the man he had replaced. Cuauhtémoc needed the girl nearby more in this situation. Since she had been given to the strangers, the people in the countryside had occasionally combined her name with that of their enemy Cortés, whenever they weren't matching him with Malintzin, with whom they sometimes confused Tequechpotzin, likely to the disgrace of the royal family. He needed to prove this girl was his own, with royal lines and symbolic meaning. He expressed this to her verbally and physically. Cuauhtémoc's authority was far from absolute in the outside world, though. Despite his zeal, he could not retain enough Altepetls on his side, even though he did bring many allies to the city, including some of the devoted Texcocans and even some of Ixtlilxochitl's brothers. The Europeans' technological advantages gradually isolated the city dwellers from food supplies. Their seclusion was increasing, but not yet total. They were thankful for their banner-happy people, fish, birds, lake algae, and chinampas. They celebrated loyalty by singing songs around the fire at night. 49. They prayed as the weeks turned into months. The enemy then arrived one day. This was unexpected, even though Mexico had expected it. The strangers had been in the neighborhood for a few months, gathering across the water in Texcoco on the lake's eastern shore to assemble their boats. On the other hand, everyone had expected to approach the island gradually. It was unknown to the populace how many people the ships could carry, or how quickly they could sail when the wind was behind them. One morning, the brigs headed directly for the Zoquipan, or mudflats, neighborhood on the island's shore. The locals called out to their children as they frantically ran around. They frantically paddled for their lives and threw the children into canoes. The Spaniards and Tlaxcalans moved into a deserted area as their craft filled the lake. After plundering it, they went back to their ships. In the weeks that followed, a pattern became apparent. The foreigners used their cannons to demolish entire buildings, and even the walls the Mexicans had erected as barriers. Then, with the protection of long-range crossbows and guns, the foreigners dispatched their native allies to fill the canals with sand or rubble. With their horses and lances, the Spaniards could easily control an open, level area once they had it. The Spaniards killed at least dozens of the Mexica each day. At one point, they killed several hundred in a single day. Bit by bit, they came pressing us back against the wall at Tlatelolco, herding us together, recalled one of the warriors in his later years. The older man recalled additional details, particularly his and his friends' difficulties in fulfilling the Spaniards' task. They contested every inch of land, occasionally unearthing filled-in canals at night. In addition to performing death-defying stunts, famous warriors have occasionally been able to bring down a horse and its rider. They could separate and defeat sizable contingents of Spaniards twice, once with 15 of them and again with maybe 53. They strung the prisoners' heads in a gory necklace and left it hanging in the air after offering the prisoners as offerings atop the tallest pyramid in front of their pale fellow citizens. Sometimes, the younger boys who watched were astounded by the bravery of individual warriors. On one occasion, the Spaniards arrived at a neighborhood nobody had anticipated until the following day. They took into custody the women and children who had not yet escaped. Axoquentzin, pronounced Ashokentzin, rushed forward as a warrior. He seemed to have superhuman strength because of his anger. He sprinted out into the open, grabbed a Spaniard, and spun him around until he dropped a girl he had captured. Axoquentzin then grabbed another man and tossed him around. Such stories lived in the collective memory and the people's songs 30 years later, and the fearlessness of their greatest warriors made them immensely proud. However, this action could not last forever, and the Spaniards brought him down. They shot an iron bolt into his heart. He passed away as if he were lying down to sleep. Nowhere do the warriors appear to have been awed or paralyzed by the stranger's weapons. Rather, they examined them directly. The crossbowman was excellent at aiming the bolt. He aimed it straight at the target, and when it fired, it made a whining, hissing, and humming sound. Their arrows did not miss anything. They all hit and went through people. They aimed and pointed the guns directly at people, and the shot caught them off guard. It killed them without warning. A bullet would kill a target if it hit a dangerous area like the forehead, the nape of the neck, the heart, the chest, the stomach, or the abdomen. Unfortunately, Mexico could not effectively use the powerful weapons they had secured. At one point, they forced captured crossbowmen to try to teach them to shoot metal bows, but the lessons were ineffective, and the arrows went astray. They soon learned the guns would not work without the powder the Spanish had. Once, when they captured a cannon, they concluded they had neither the experience nor the ammunition needed to make it useful. The best they could do was to prevent it from falling back into enemy hands, so they sank it in the lake. They learned to craft extra long spears to counter the Spanish lances, and to swiftly maneuver their canoes in unexpected patterns, making it difficult for the Spaniards to aim from their brigantines. Yet such tactics could not bring them victory. They could only hinder their enemies. The older men, recalling their people's efforts, found it too painful to express this directly, but one of them came close. In this way, the war took somewhat longer. Even if it were to have had no other effect, which indeed it had not, the terror it caused would be so great that we thought the enemy might surrender. Cortés wrote of the Spanish decision to build a catapult on one occasion in the hopes of frightening the Indians. However, our dreams were not realized as the enemy persisted in their fear, and the carpenters could not operate their machinery. Consequently, we had to justify the catalyst's failure by saying that our decision to spare them was motivated by compassion. Cortés was only appeasing his emotions here. The incident was humorous to the Mexican, who rejected his argument that his actions were motivated solely by compassion. Then, the Spaniards erected a wooden sling atop an altar platform to throw stones at the populace. Once they had wound up the wooden sling, its arm rose upwards, but instead of hitting the people, the stone fell almost straight down behind the Zamolco marketplace, which caused the Spaniards to quarrel. They were arguing so intensely that it appeared as though they were shoving each other in the face. In the meantime, the catapult continued to oscillate, moving in both directions. But there were few opportunities for the warriors to have a friendly chat. The Mexicans were aware of their defeat, They could not explain the disparity in power between themselves and their adversaries. They were unaware that the Europeans were the descendants of a tradition of sedentary living that dated back 10,000 years, while they were only 3,000. It's interesting to note that despite everything, they maintained a practical comprehension of the circumstances. They recognized the required explanations. They did not believe their adversaries were more intelligent or of higher caliber. Instead, they highlighted two aspects in their descriptions: the Spanish use of metal and their remarkable communication system. As they described their experiences, the elderly men stressed the Spanish people's use of tepostli, metal, iron, above all else. They dressed their bodies in iron. They adorned their heads with iron and used iron for their lances, swords, bows, and shields. Their iron lances and halberds seemed to sparkle, and their iron swords curved like a stream of water, they continued. Their iron helmets and cuirasses appeared to make a clanging sound. The old speakers paused in awe of what had happened, wondering how the news of their glorious kingdom had reached so many people on the other side of the world so effectively. The war riggers had seen the ships, but not the printing presses, the navigational aids, the compasses, or the technical maps that allowed the conquest. It is amazing how quickly they realized how important these issues were. Given the effects of smallpox and the eventual starvation of the Mexicans, the fighting lasted for 3 months, far longer than the Spaniards would have thought possible. After 4 weeks of war, the warriors shouted to the Tlaxcalans that they wanted to talk to the woman from here. When Malintzin came, they offered full and immediate peace, on condition that the Spaniards would return to their home across the sea. While we stood there arguing through the interpreter, Cortés remembered, with nothing more than a fallen bridge between us and the enemy, an old man, in full view of everyone, very slowly extracted from his knapsack certain provisions and ate them, to make us believe that they were in no need of supplies. The Mexica engaged in a lengthy conversation, describing the tribute they intended to offer without Malintzin taking a break to translate. They agreed that she would provide a summary later. We fought no more that day, for the lords had told the interpreter to convey their proposals to me, said Cortés. He rejected those proposals in the morning. By August 13th, the remaining part of their city had almost completely collapsed, despite the Mexica's attempts to show they had plenty of food and brave warriors. On the roads lay shattered bones and scattered hair. The houses were red, bloody, and without roofs. The houses' walls were slippery with brains, and worms were scuttling along the roads. The survivors had consumed everything, including softened adobe bricks, tiny insects and lizards, and even deer hides. They were now all suffering from dysentery. Cuauhtémoc gave himself up to the Spaniards in a canoe with his wife Tecuichpotzin and his close advisors. He only requested that his people seek food in the countryside. The fighting ceased, and the people began to hear that they could leave, visit relatives in other apartments if they had any, bring valuables to exchange for food, or just beg. As they sped along the broken causeways or waded and swam across the lake with the surviving adults, those who were children recalled the sense of release, the rush of hope, and the joy. Some adults let out distant cries of mourning, while others witnessed individual Spaniards seizing young women despite the agreement. However, the kids couldn't help but be pleased about this turn of events. The realization that their world was ending, as they understood it, was still unclear to them. Tecuichpotzin watched them leave with hollow eyes. The mysterious lake city. The intense sun outside scorched the patio's stones, while the thick adobe walls inside remained dark and cool. A young Chalcan nobleman, Quetzalcoatl, Quetzalcoatl, stopped on the threshold of the Mexican Tlatoani's palace one afternoon in 1479 to give his eyes time to adjust. Many years later, a man from his Altepetl explained that he was considering what judgment would come forth from the king. Quetzalcoatl had never felt such a sense of dread in his stomach, as he could tell by the glances among his fellow citizens that they believed he had been called in to endure cruel punishment. They believed they would take him to one of the infamous wooden cages in the capital city for the final burn. Following the servants' cues, Quetzalcoatl found it nearly impossible to proceed, leaving his friends to wonder, will we all burn to death? However, he did. The king chose his name, Flamingo Snake, to match the exquisitely embroidered, vibrantly colored garments he donned for his musical performances. As he walked, the waves wavered. He stood in for the larger altar of Chalco here in Tenochtitlan. He only wanted these Mexicans to see his pride, not his fear. He redoubled his determination and persisted. It's impossible to pinpoint exactly what transpired in the palace of Axayacatl, Ashayacat, over 500 years ago. The existing account was written at least a century later by someone who could not have been there. It does, however, provide insightful information. The Nahua historian Chimalpahin, who lived in Mexico City in the early 1600s, wrote the work. His beloved grandmother had known Quetzalcoatl when she was a girl, but he was already an older man and had adopted the Christian name Don Geronimo. He was Chalcan. Older relatives who had known members of the Ancien Regime provided the Chalcan historian with his information. His account aligns well with many other sources that shed light on various topics, such as the city's cultural mores, Tenochtitlan's architectural patterns, and the political relations between Tenochtitlan and Chalco. Around the same time, Chimalpahin talked to his grandmother about this event. For example, some Mexican men were telling the Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagon how scary it used to be to perform music in front of the ruler, because he might punish a bad performer. There is no reason to question the main points of Chimalpahin's account, because the author describes life in the imperial court of Tenochtitlan in vivid detail. In actuality, examining it in light of other existing sources can teach one a lot. By 1479, Mexico had dissolved its royal houses and destroyed Chalco almost 15 years earlier. Not enough time had passed for the Chalcan people to forget their ancient royal lines and the centuries-long self-governance they had enjoyed. But not enough time had passed for a new generation of young adults to vividly recall the atrocities of the war. The generation of Quetzalcoatl had become restless and started to argue among themselves, demanding that Tenochtitlan grant them a seat at the council table and treat them on an equal footing with the other Central Valley major powers. The High King Axayacatl had invited Flamingo Snake and his fellow singers and drummers to perform at his palace. They claimed that their sole purpose was to amuse him. They had chosen their song with a political agenda in mind. They referred to the composition as the Chalca Woman's Song. They were effectively protesting as they sang its lyrics. The singer took on the role of a concubine, a female prisoner of war. The similarities between a captured woman and an alien she conquered were obvious to everyone in their world. In everyday life and marriage, they saw women as equals, not inferiors to men. Another Chalco nobleman led the afternoon performance but passed out from heat exhaustion or fear of the group's punishment. The entertainment had to be extraordinary to persuade Axayacatl to take Chalco's feelings about the situation into consideration, and Quetzalcoatl realized that his own and his elders' fates were at stake. So he stepped around his unconscious compatriot and took the lead himself. He gave the performance everything he had. He made the gilt-edged drum throb and called out. He passionately sang the lyrics, and the song concluded with the concubine vowing to coexist peacefully with her new master, the king, provided she received respect. "This is your hand. Hold my hand, and come along. Be happy. Rest in peace on your throne and on your red mat. You, who is King Axayacatl, calm down." When he reached the dance floor, Axayacatl lifted one foot, utterly thrilled to hear the music, and started to dance and move in circles. He wore a gold headpiece trimmed with symbolic clusters of feathers, each representing his rank and his city's relationship to others. Suddenly, during the performance, Axayacatl started to pay attention. He emerged from hiding with his women and started dancing. The exquisitely designed diadem was a sight to behold. Including the Tlatoani in the dance was a tremendous honor, a historic event. As a result, the Chalcans were optimistic and the signs were encouraging. But as the song ended, the king abruptly entered and sent a messenger to call for the main act. The Chalcans were terrified and unsure of what to do next. Upon arriving before Axayacatl, Quecho Coco 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 Uire discovered him encircled by his women, all dressed in exquisitely embroidered blouses and skirts trimmed with yellow parakeet feathers, dyed rabbit fur, or other vibrant accents. Kneeling, he scooped up earth and touched it to his lips, making the traditional Nahua gesture of obeisance. "O Lord King, may you burn me, I, your vassal, for we have done wrong in your presence," he said. Quetzalcoatl reportedly believed that self-deprecation might be helpful in this situation, as it was a courteous greeting. It turned out that he was too cautious. The Tlatoani liked the song and the singer, but Axayacatl did not want to hear these words. Before putting him to bed, he asked Quetzalcoatl to vow to sing exclusively for him. "Women, get up and meet him. Sit him among you. Here has come your rival," Chimalpahin exclaimed joyfully to his wives. In response to direct and highly judgmental questions about the topic, scholars have mostly relied on sources created under the friars' auspices, making it difficult to understand the nature of homosexual sex among the Aztecs. Even though the respondents made some unfavorable remarks and were well aware that they should not have supported the practice, it remains difficult to understand their thoughts. Indigenous writers from the 17th century would later write about the harsh punishments that the church inflicted on homosexual men, but it seems that they did not enjoy such scenes. Their disapproval was subtle, if anything. One of the men was named Diego Enamorado, Diego in love. King Axayacatl was a renowned warrior who fathered numerous children and had a strong attraction to both men and women. The king really loved Flamingo Snake because he got him to dance, Chimalpahin, the Chalcan historian, later commented. Chimalpahin expressed no judgment, possibly out of pride, as Flamingo Snake's song became a multi-generational hit, receiving repeated performances over the next several decades and bringing fame to his hometown. Because of it, Amaquamecan, Ah, Mah, Kai, Mai, Khan, was once famous, an altar petal that now appears small and unimportant, he said. The singer's relationship with Tlatoani at the time was one of immense pride, and to reassure the Chalcans who were waiting anxiously on the patio, Axayacatl sent Quetzalcoatl back outside with symbolic gifts: a whole outfit, cloak, loincloth, and sandals, embroidered with jade, all of which had belonged to the king. Flamingo Snake's companions understood what such gifts meant, because public gift-giving was a political language, a code everyone knew. For example, in the annals of Cuautitlan, the narrator only had to laconically state, "He gave him only one tilma," or cloak. 18. The Chalcans erupted in joy, and the more confident ones started to mock those who had solely predicted a bleak future. That night, the visiting musicians celebrated in the greatest city in the known world. A house for entertainers lodged them in the middle of the island. 20 subdivisions, Moyotlan, Atzacoalco, Cuepopan, and Zoquiapan, divided Tenochtitlan, occupying about a quarter of the city. As with most conglomerate apartments, the people of each segment placed their finest buildings in the Four Corners area, where the quadrants came together, thus creating a truly urban area in the center of a partly agricultural world. Around the edges of the swampy island, they maintained their chinampas, which are gardens suspended in muddy water, and set aside specific areas for fishing and aquatic foraging, for delicacies such as birds' eggs. In the center of the island where the visitors were, rose the temple precinct, including the huge gleaming pyramid dedicated to their own Huitzilopochtli, and next to it, the edifice dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god. Directly behind these was Axayacattl's palace, a clay aqueduct, which originated on a hill on the lake's western shore and crossed over a causeway to the island, fed it with fresh running water, forming part of an extraordinary waterworks system that included dikes, sluices, causeways, and aqueducts. Now that Moctezuma had passed away, the palace of the former king, Moctezuma, the Elder, on the far side of the temple precinct, had shifted its purpose from housing royalty. The most powerful monarchs each left impressive architectural remnants of their reigns, visible to all the world for all time, or so they hoped, and the state found plenty of practical uses for them. In this central area, for example, the war captives who faced sacrifice shortly were closely guarded. Some were housed sumptuously, others much less so, depending on the ceremonial role they were to fill. Chalcans are no longer prisoners, unlike a few years ago. Nearby, the Mexica king maintained a zoo filled with animals brought far and wide as tribute from subject states. On holy days, the Mexica king would display some of these animals facing the cutting stone, while others remained on display indefinitely as a testament to Mexica power. The visitors could have seen fascinating reptiles, such as jaguars, wolves, and mountain lions, among other creatures. Unlike in the wild, the visitors didn't need to fear the yowling of an animal. In the forest lands, if one suddenly heard the mewling or scream of a flesh-eating animal, some people feared it meant that one would soon be taken prisoner and enslaved or killed, or that one's children would become prisoners. On Quetzalcoatl's evening in the city, however, he had nothing to fear, but much to hope for. He and his peers concentrated on the potential restoration of some measure of independence for their beloved Chalco. They feasted on the food that their hosts provided, including tamales with decorative designs on top, like a seashell outlined with red beans, winged ants with savory herbs, spicy tomato sauces, fried onions and squash, fish eggs, and toasted corn, and a variety of fruits, tortillas with honey, and little cakes made of amaranth seed. In fact, a former servant once reported that 2,000 dishes had been prepared for the Mexican king, which his counselors, servants, and entertainers then ate. And the drink was always chocolate, crushed cacao beans steeped in hot water, flavored with honey, and various dried flowers, like roses or vanilla pods. The drink was served by carved or painted gourds, often from distant lands, and was all the more special for it. However, it's possible that visitors didn't specifically remember the zoo or the food in later years. People who saw the city always remembered its beauty first. The Tlatoani's gardens and ordinary people's flat rooftop gardens were the primary sources of this beauty. There, Mexico's most gorgeous flowers, many with names never perfectly translated into European tongues, blossomed amid trees whose fascinating shapes could make them appear enchanted. In large, finely wrought wooden cages, the brightest birds from the jungles in the east and south fluttered and sang. Quetzal birds and parrots, flamingos and tufted ducks, parakeets and pheasants, too many kinds to count. As the birds flew quickly in and out of the foliage, the colors of their wings glinted in the evening light like flashes of magic, the result of some spell, just like in the stories people told back in Chalco. As the darkness grew, the stars appeared. Priests observed and charted them, but ordinary people just admired them. The stars looked, and the Mexico sometimes joked, like popcorn scattered in the night sky. Where had this city come from? The unkempt, marshy town Itzcoatl inhabited during his bid for power was far from Tenochtitlan in the 1470s and 80s. However, under his leadership and that of Moctezuma the Elder, the Mexica's relative wealth and power increased significantly. The Central Valley of Mexico now contains about 1.5 million people, mostly farmers. In the very center of the fertile basin, on this little island of 5.5 square miles, there lived as many as 50,000 people. 27. The estimated population of the wider urban area, counting the Altepetls gathered on the lake's far shore facing the island, was perhaps 100,000. Tenochtitlan's population growth had outpaced that of other regions. This was partly due to the city's wealth and political dominance, which encouraged immigration. However, war victories also brought more captive women to the city. And as any demographer would predict, more wombs gave birth to more babies. The relatively few Chinese on the city's outskirts could not support such a large population. Instead, the city folk obtained much of their food from the rural hinterland. Mexico's success in warfare made it possible to demand greater amounts of food as tribute. Additionally, the growing population of the basin made it economically attractive for the people to voluntarily bring food to sell in exchange for the artisan craftwork that the urbanites were becoming increasingly adept at producing. In this context, the city's location on an island in the center of a great lake made it almost easy for its market to become a great trade hub, tying together all the people living near the surrounding lake shores. The buildings were arranged along orderly, straight streets, and unlike in ancient Paris or London, the rapid growth necessitated planned and organized construction. Ordinary households consisted of dwellings on 3 or 4 sides of a central courtyard, with flat roofs, holding gardens, and occasionally additional small rooms, often used for storage. Whether the women of the house were co-wives or mother-in-law and daughters-in-law, each had her own supply of chihuatlacqui, women's gear arranged in orderly baskets and boxes, spindles and looms, grinding stones and pots, brooms and dustbins, as well as clothing and jewelry for adults and children. Men kept their gear, including carefully accumulated handmade weapons, battle headdresses, and war mementos, in a prominent place in the house. There was no furniture, and people sat and slept on thick, comfortable mats and pillows. The massive twin temples of the central plaza, flanked by the royal tekpan, or palace, where the Chalcan visitors formed, towered over the simple structures, each surrounded by highly decorated compounds for the nobility. Itzcoatl had long ago started transforming the simple shrine that had once stood at the center of the island into an elaborate structure on a broad stone platform, and since then, the city's architects and builders, under the direction of the Tlatoani, have undergone several more building stages, each of which has added to the splendor of the 2 temples. Axayacatl recently built a significantly higher aqueduct with 2 water troughs to ensure uninterrupted water flow, even if one needed cleaning or repair. Just before the severe famine in 1449, the original aqueduct, intended to bring fresh water to the island, collapsed in a flood. Mexico brought all this about so successfully, largely because the transition to the next generation of leadership had twice gone relatively smoothly. Itzcoatl's son, Tezozomoc, had kept his word and willingly forgone the possibility of ruling, as agreed long ago, accepting lands and tribute payers in Ecatepec near Azcapotzalco instead. From Hummingbird Feather's line, Moctezuma succeeded Itzcoatl. Following Moctezuma's death, they selected a ruler from among Tezozomoc's sons, as per their agreement. Tezozomoc's elder sons had been born to wives whose marriages predated the rise of Itzcoatl and his family, but the youngest one, Axayacatl, or water beetle, was his son by one of Moctezuma's daughters, Atotoztli. Perhaps the young woman was Moctezuma's granddaughter, the child of a daughter of Moctezuma's who had married Tlacaelel. The bards disagreed. Regardless, she maintained a close relationship with Moctezuma, whose sons he directly related to, and whom he envisioned as a future occupant of the reed mat. Axayacatl was thus the son of Tezozomoc, whom Moctezuma desired as a successor. Moctezuma did everything he could to ensure that the royal clan would decide to follow him after his death. He bribed, threatened, and used young Axayacatl whenever possible. Ahuitzotl loudly complained at the customary council of royal family members after his death, denouncing the young prince crudely. "Is he a manly warrior? Does he actually capture people? Aren't they actually slaves that he buys and brings here to give the impression that he is a powerful warrior?" The two older brothers, however, who demanded to be regarded as themselves if there was another transition in their lives, abandoned the matter when they were granted high military titles and lucrative sources of income. Soon after Moctezuma died in 1469, Axayacatl ascended to the throne. This seemed to bode well for the strengthening of Mexican authority. Unfortunately, a particular succession problem went unsolved, becoming a crisis for the athletic young Axayacatl, who expertly navigated a war canoe like a water beetle on the lake's surface. Many years ago, shortly after the Mexica had settled on their island and established themselves, an internal conflict arose, leading a rebellious group to establish a separate village on the island's north shore. They gained notoriety for holding the largest market on the island and trading with villages around the lake. Refusing to live and work under the rule of the larger group's king, the smaller breakaway group created their own Tlatoani and named their separate Altepetl Tlatelolco, Tla-tel-o-el-co. 32. The Tlatelolcans, with their Mexican heritage and pride, remained united with the Tenochtitlan people in the face of the division. Maxtla of Azcapotzalco sent some of his relatives to kill Tlatelolco's king after he killed Chimalpopoca in 1426. When Itzcoatl rallied the Mexica of Tenochtitlan to help him overthrow Azcapotzalco, the Tlatelolcans immediately joined him. Tlatelolco served as Tenochtitlan's junior partner for the next 50 years, assisting the larger town in winning battles and receiving a portion of the proceeds. For example, the inhabitants of Toluca in the west and Cuautinchan in the east subsequently recalled the arrogance of the Tlatelolcans, who demanded tribute from them. But by 1470, the residents of Tlatelolco were bitter. Tenochtitlan's quick rise, they believed, was due to the military assistance the Tenochca had consistently received from their relatives on the island's north shore. They also controlled the large market that all the valley's inhabitants frequented. They were unhappy that Axayacatl, whose mother was Tlatelolcan, had succeeded him as king rather than one of his older half-brothers. Tlatelolco might have anticipated greater rewards if one of the half-Tlatelolcans had risen to the throne. They aimed to demonstrate their steadfast support for Tenochtitlan by calling for reforms. Their Tlatoani, Mokihuixtli, pronounced Mokiwishtli, made a statement regarding the succession by rearranging their marital relations, a practice known to Nahua kings in similar circumstances. Mokiwishtli was adamant that his Tenochca wife would no longer be his main consort, and that her offspring would not acquire any position of authority. He stated that the reason she wouldn't have children was because he wouldn't engage in sexual relations with her. Sarcastically, he added that no man could find attraction in such a thin, frail-looking little thing, and he preferred his other women. It's unclear if Mokihuixtli believed he could get better terms from Tenochtitlan, or if his real goal was to start a war and try to overthrow Axayacatl. The latter seems more likely, considering his history of making aggressive remarks that were, at best, irrational, and at worst, ridiculous. In either case, the young Tenochca wife that Axayacatl turned against was Chalchiuhnanetzin. Chalchiunetzin, Jade Doll, his full sister. The young Tlatoani publicly sent his sister expensive gifts to gain political support after hearing what Mokihuixtli had to say. Mokihuixtli took them from her, along with the elegant clothes she had brought to the wedding, and left her to borrow the blouses and skirts of the working women. Rumors and storytellers claim that Mokihuixtli eventually beat her, forcing her to stand naked alongside the other women as he examined them. Chalchiuhnanetzin now slept among the stones used to grind the cornmeal. However, she might have benefited from the borrowed clothes and the servant role. One day she managed to escape, likely maneuvering through the streets undetected, and returned to her brother's palace. She shared everything with Axayacca. He says he will destroy us, Mexica Tenochca, and that Tlatelolco will be the only rulership. I have heard him say this. He has provided his allies with shields and war clubs equipped with obsidian blades. Consultations take place at night. Mokihuixtli quickly prepared for the war in 1473 by forming numerous alliances, primarily with his tribute states, the Altepetls, whose royal lines intermarried with his own. Many others rejected his overtures, or at least informed Tenochtitlan they had. Axayacatl did not want to appear to be investing a lot of resources in a humiliating internecine squabble. At first, the Tlatelolcans were able to hold their own. They were defeated, but they survived. The battle was inconclusive. Each group withdrew and hunkered down in its own area of the island, leaving a long-lasting silence. Such a situation could not last, though. Tenochtitlan was too powerful. Later, whether days or months, the city's men and their allies were ready to do their job. They went forth in massive bodies. Some people claimed that the people of Tlatelolco were so enraged by now that the women bared their bodies in an insulting gesture, and that those who could squeeze milk at the oncoming enemy were rewarded. The annals of Tlatelolco proudly noted that their women fought in the final stages of the war against the Spaniards, as if this was culturally appropriate in extreme situations. Even though the women of Tlatelolco engaged in combat on this occasion, the men from Tenochtitlan, led by Axayacatl himself, remained unfazed. The Tenochca were far more numerous than the women. They drove the remaining Tlatelolcan warriors off the island's northern tip into the marshy lake. And still, they chased them, beating the reeds and killing them wherever they found them. It was said that the Tenochca made them quack like ducks. And thereafter, if anyone wanted to taunt a Tlatelolcan, they had only to call him a duck. Perhaps more importantly, the Tenochca ended Tlatelolco's royal line, forbidding anyone to sit on their red mat again. Either his people threw Mokihuixtli from the heights of their temple pyramid, or he chose to hurl himself downward and end his own life. The historians couldn't reach a consensus on this matter. Likely, only those who fought to the top of the temple knew the truth. The story of his fall lived on in popular memory. Curious Spaniards later prepared a dramatic historical image of his great descent from the pyramid. From now on, said Axayacatl, the Tlatelolcans would pay tribute like everyone else, including a quota of enslaved people for sacrifice. The latter charge carried significant weight, requiring the losing party to engage in unprepared wars against others. In the end, however, he does not seem to have enforced the demand. An older man, a relative of his and Mokihuixtli's, prostrated before the king and begged for mercy for the Tlatelolcans. During this period of the 1470s and 80s, Mexican power grew significantly. Axayacatl routinely interfered with the governance of other city-states. In 1472, for instance, old Nezahualcoyotl of Texcoco, who had joined with Itzcoatl to bring down Maxtla and the Tepaneca in the 1420s, had died, marking the end of an era. According to one count, he left behind 60 sons and 57 daughters, with many boys wanting to rule. Axayacatl naturally wanted a son by a close female relative of his own to be the heir. Axayacatl had already chosen Nezahualpilli, whose name signified Hungry Prince, and referenced his father, Hungry Coyote. The problem was that Nezahualpilli, only 9 years old, some even claiming he was only 7, would find it challenging to outshine his 59 older brothers, several of whom descended from noble mothers. Later, the Spaniards would nod sagely and say the tiny child must have inherited because he was the only legitimate heir. One friar imagined tragic scenes in which an aging Nezahualpilli had almost given up hope of his wife producing an heir. At the time, however, the polygynous Nahua world did not entertain the notion that only one woman's son could conceivably inherit. The people would have been highly amused at the idea that there were no other possible choices when there were 117 siblings in existence. The problem was that Nezahualcoyotl had too many heirs. Axayacatl took the initiative to defend Nezahualpilli's claim. The history tellers accused one son, Tetzauhpiltzintli, literally, Prince Terrifying, of amassing weapons and disobeying his father, leading to his execution. Regardless of the veracity of this accusation, the Tenochca king remained steadfast in his demands, and after his death, he dispatched both warriors and bribes to Texcoco post-haste. Most of the half-brothers accepted a buyout, but a few, fathered in Nezahualcoyotl's early years as a fugitive in the Tlaxcala region, came to make war. Their presence allowed some of the other brothers, raised in Texcoco, to band together and support their baby brother, Nezahualpilli, to keep power from passing to their father's children from a long-ago wife. The child's status as Tenochtitlan's favorite candidate also played a significant role. Naturally, there were some resentments about Mexico always dictating to them, but Axayacatl paid the rejected candidates generously in terms of land and titles. And because there were so many potential heirs, his emissaries' arrival on the scene averted an internal Texcocan bloodbath that might have ensued. Axayacatl implicitly promised to continue to support. Texcoco had faithful dealings with other Altepetls, as long as his chosen candidate was king. In summary, Mexican rule was not solely based on terror tactics, at least not among their allies. On some occasions, Axayacatl even knew enough to step back and let the local people have a bit more of their own way. This ultimately occurred in Chalco. Following the performance of Quetzalcoatl's political song in 1479, negotiations began, eventually reinstating the royal lines of the 4 Altepetls of Chalco They, in effect, became part of the inner circle of the Tenochca state. Within the Central Valley, Axayacatl sought to maintain perfect stability. Then, in 1481, after only 12 years of rule, Axayacatl died. Given his youth upon ascending to the throne and his active role as a warrior, it appears probable that he met his demise in combat. However, the historians of his people do not confirm this, although they recount instances where he sustained injuries, narrowly escaped capture, or achieved remarkable victories. 42. His death apparently occurred before his people were quite ready for a transition. A fraternal struggle ensued after his death. The royal clan elected his oldest half-brother, Tizok, to the reed mat. He must not have mustered the needed margin of support to maintain power, however, for he went down in history as a coward despite waging nearly constant warfare. After only about 5 years of rule, some say 4, others 6, he died, prompting open discussions about the possibility that an enemy faction had poisoned him. His brother Ahuitzotl now followed. He ruled successfully enough, but by the time he died in 1502, it was expected that the pendulum of power would swing back to the other branch of the family, the one descended from Huitzilihuitl, not Itzcoatl. Under Ahuitzotl, the death of Tlacaelel, the old Xiuhcoatl, and his replacement by one of his sons solidified the council's institution, allowing its meetings to continue uninterrupted despite losing a key individual. In selecting the Tlatoani, the royal clan overwhelmingly backed a son of Axayacatl, Moctezuma Xocoyotl, or Moctezuma the Younger. In 1502, posterity described Moctezuma as a young, charismatic man, fearful and pusillanimous, despite his lack of familiarity with 20th century political science textbooks. Still, early Nahuatl sources depict him as a tough man with a tough agenda. The Altepetls in the Central Valley, including Chalco and Tlatelolco, had put an end to their rebellion, and the Mexica were prepared to take full control over the several hundred Altepetls outside the inner basin. They, along with their empire partners, had already collected tribute from these Altepetls, but had largely left them to their own ways, provided they did not rebel. Moctezuma wanted to increase the level of direct control. He started by setting up 38 administrative provinces. There were later 55 provinces. Each with its own important task of the local Mexico officials was to collect all the required tributes on time. They continued to work on synchronizing the calendars of various Altepetls to ensure it was clear when tribute was due, and they held public ceremonies that were documented in paintings, clearly delineating what and when each Altepetl owed. However, tribute collection was no longer the officials' only task. They supported Nahua merchants involved in long-distance trade, who, without the backing of Mexican royal authority, were at the mercy of locals. With this support, they could orchestrate luxury trades over impressively long distances. The officials also oversaw local diplomatic negotiations and inheritance. They also acted as judges, upholding certain notions of law and justice, particularly regarding landholding. Moctezuma aimed to standardize this practice, as each area dedicated some lands to supporting Tenochtitlan. The Tlatoani of each local Altepetl would continue, as he always had, to distribute farmlands among his own people. But in the case of any unresolved disputes, and certainly of any disputes with other Altepetls, it was the prerogative of Tenochca judges to decide upon the proper distribution. They frequently intervened. Years later, long after the Spaniards took power, some local families still harbored resentment over Tenochtitlan's decisions, which remained largely in effect due to the influence of custom. In some ways, generations of Nahua tradition shaped Moctezuma and his counselors' vision of a well-regulated political body. Their political organization had long revolved around what a leading historian called a cellular principle. That is to say, no individual human being was considered to exist alone in life, but only in others, and no group existed alone, but thrived in connections with others around them. Families formed kin-based clans, commonly referred to as kalpolli, which in turn formed an altar petal. These altar petals, in turn, frequently merged into a larger altar petal. From time immemorial, the different components of a polity had rotated unpleasant tasks, such as maintaining a local temple, clearing weeds from a lake shore to form a port, or collecting a tribute to hand over to a conqueror. So, too, was there the tradition of passing the chieftainship back and forth between lineages to avoid breeding resentment. In a sense, the Tenochtitlan state had gained enough power to formalize some of these traditions on a large scale. But with a twist. They, and no others, would always hold the head of this carefully balanced political body, a position they had worked hard to achieve. The social organization began at home. Tenochtitlan offered a shining example of the world Moctezuma had in mind. The Kalpolli further divided the city's 4 quarters, or subalterpetals, into units akin to parishes or wards, each housing noble, pili families, among the commoner, Machehwali families. The Machehwali families supported the noble families by paying them tribute. They worked hard in the chinampsas, or a craftsman's workshop, while the noble families organized their endeavors. Over the years, there had been relatively little tension within each Kalpolli. Certain families had been more special than others for so many generations that their lineage was unquestioned. Every category of people understood their important role in life. Often, the Mexica conceived of society as one of their beloved birds. The Pipiltin might be the head, but the Macahualtin was the tail, the wings. And what bird could fly without its tail and wings? It was a beautiful idea, and one deeply familiar to Mexico. However, in later years, there were signs that threats to relative peace were more common than in the past. As the nobility brought more captive women home and had more children, the Pipiltin families were on the verge of becoming too large for the Macahualtin. Moctezuma, the elder, once had too many children to expect the Macahualtin to provide for them all with tribute, and he recalled saying, "Not all of my children will rule." He concluded that they required training to become elite craftsmen, like scribes, lapidaries, and sculptors, and the problem only got worse. This was also the case in Texas, where an elderly woman in the 16th century recalled her childhood. "Back when I was growing up, there was an infinite number of nobles. The palaces of rulers and nobles boasted an abundance of noble houses. It resembled a single enormous palace. Minor lords and lesser relatives were innumerable, and the number of commoners who were their dependents or enslaved people was as enormous as the number of ants. This situation led to numerous logistical challenges. The nobility cultivated a detailed understanding of who qualified as a potential heir, and which family members earned noble status through contributions from commoners. They even came up with a matching vocabulary. They reduced the number of claimants by half by deciding that official status had to be inherited through the male line. At this point, the arrangement of each Kalpolli grew increasingly rigid. Each had representatives tasked with collecting tribute, planning public projects, such as temple repairs, and arbitrating and resolving conflicts. A high court known as the Tlaxitlan, meaning the place at the foot of something, the foot of the ruler, oversaw the complaints of the nobility and commoners. Despite the lack of written laws, the judges imposed penalties for violating specific principles of legal tradition. For instance, Everyone was guilty of adultery, which carried a stoning or strangling penalty. The specifics of the offence varied depending on the sex. Married men could engage in extramarital sex, but they would face consequences if they had an affair with a married woman. Married women could not engage in extramarital affairs. If an indebted parent sold a young person into slavery, they had the right to certain protections and the opportunity to purchase their way out of slavery, if feasible. Theoretically, those rights were universal. When questioned by Spaniards, some later claimed that the Mexican kings occasionally attempted to assist families in purchasing the return of their loved ones from far-off places. However, once they transported them to the east, locating them would have been impossible. Thousands believed in a fixed law, even without a written code. The numerous markets, including the enormous one developed at the island's north end in Tlatelolco, and the smaller ones in each Calpolli neighborhood, were also meticulously managed by officials who ultimately reported to Moctezuma and his council. Women made up a significant portion of the commerce officials, given their significant role in market life as both buyers and sellers. They did not hesitate to report and discipline any delinquents, and they carried their office staff with pride. It would be regrettable for anyone to cheat customers, steal from vendors, or even get into a fight at the market. 4 days after the Europeans arrived, a Spaniard who had seen the market at Tlatelolco recalled it with a sense of wonder, because it was enormous and yet so well organized. We were amazed at the large number of people and the amounts of goods, as well as at the orderliness and neat arrangements that prevailed, because we had never seen such a thing before. The chieftains who accompanied us pointed everything out. The chieftains kept each type of merchandise separate and marked a fixed place for it. One part of the market featured luxury goods: gold and silver, turquoise, jade, other gems, and the feathers of exotic birds. Merchants sold these to artisans as raw materials and wealthy customers as finely crafted textiles and beautiful jewelry. Likewise, they sold plain cotton thread or cloth, beautifully embroidered cloaks, and other clothing. In another area, they offered firewood, lumber, and wood, carved into tool handles, paddles, and columns for buildings. They sold copper axe heads and needles, white bark paper, pitch pine for torches, rubber balls, herbal medicines, tobacco, pipes, and row upon row of ceramic pots and dishes. They hawked goods made of sisal, twine, rope, nets, and sandals, as well as all manner of animal furs, tanned or untanned, dyed or undyed. They sold rough grinding stones and fine obsidian knives or mirrors, in which one could see every detail of one's face. Those who had never visited the marketplace were impressed by the food section, where stalls sold everything: every kind of corn and bean, every kind of salt and herb. Birds and animals rustled in their cages, fruits and vegetables, cacao and honey, bird eggs, and delicious bars of dried algae from the lake. The capacity of Tlatelolco to partially prepare food for urban customers who are too busy to prepare everything from scratch sets it apart from local food markets. It offers pre-made tortillas, small cakes, already cut squash, smoked chilies, and ground cacao. Hungry customers could visit what essentially functioned as a restaurant, a stand selling prepared meals. Men and women, physicians and healers also operated out of the market, selling a variety of herbs that, in their experience, could help with various ailments such as blisters, constipation, diarrhea, itchy skin, eye sores, headaches, or fever. They could also perform a house ceremony to expel a malevolent force from the body, or use a method like tossing a die to determine the most effective treatment for an enigmatic ailment. Later, they would attempt to maintain the reputation of some indigenous doctors in the eyes of Europeans. Unbelievably, at least to newcomers, the market also functioned as a storehouse for the urine collected in clay pots in households throughout the city. Whether or not people were paid for their contributions or were penalized for their absences is unknown. But the practice served two purposes. The waste collection in one location made most of the city extremely clean, and the urine of the tens of thousands of people on the island was the ideal source of ammonia, which was required for tanning hides and producing salt crystals. The tanners and salt makers lined up canoes full of basins near the market, where they brought their essential supplies. Unless he had been born into a family of merchants or chosen as a likely priest, every boy studied warfare. At a separate school, priests received far more instruction on religious topics, the calendar, and the pictographic writing system than other boys. Aside from those two groups, all young men needed to develop their warrior skills. This had always been true in practically every Mexican village, but now the Mexica's supremacy depended on their performance. They could not afford any failure or uncertainty for fear of rebellion from the nearby Altepetls, who were hostile to them. They learned a craft from their parents at home, whether gluing the velvety fibers of exotic feathers into elaborate shield designs, sculpting ceramic vessels, or making tiny golden animals with charcoal and wax molds. But at 13, they all left home to train to become warriors. They swept and gathered firewood the first few weeks after school started, sang in the evenings, and had a wonderful time. Gradually, the violent exercises started. The boys gained the ability to fight and endure pain. They may battle with warriors as older teenagers, knowing that whole groups should try to capture a captive by separating a man on the battlefield from his group and cooperating as a well-trained unit to defeat him. Around the age of 20, the apprenticeship period came to an end. A man faced a life of shame if he was unable to kill or capture people on his own. During the training years, a boy may be assigned to the burden-bearer role if it becomes evident that he cannot fight effectively in any capacity. For example, he could spend the rest of his life navigating the town's waterways in a canoe filled with fresh water, leaving them in designated locations, and everyone would understand why. We don't know how frequently such a fate happened, but as a boy matured into a man, the possibility of such a fate must have been a constant worry. However, if a young man was particularly skilled in combat, he and his entire family received recognition. A commoner could rise to the rank of an honorary nobleman, eagle lord, or quaupili. He became wealthy from the enslaved people and other treasures he brought back from the conflict. Like a born nobleman, he could have multiple wives if desired, as he could provide for them and their offspring. Such men frequently received official positions, and no one questioned their legitimacy. Other boys, meanwhile, were trained to become priests. A diverse range of personalities appeared among the priests who trained them and exercised such authority in their lives. They recalled some as intelligent and considerate, and others as, predictably, cruel. After all, their purpose in the bloody sacrificial rituals was to instruct a new generation to assume their responsibilities. When a student at a Karmakak, as the schools were known, committed a particularly serious infraction, like drinking, the priests doomed him to participate in a ceremony where they attempted to drown him, or appeared to attempt to do so. They put him in the water and pulled him out. They grabbed his hair and dragged him along. They gave him a kick. He escaped the priest's grasp as he swam beneath the water, churning, beating, and swirling it up. He lay half dead when he finally made it to the shore. Gasping in his last pain, he breathed his last. At that point, the boy's parents were granted permission to take him home. The system was tainted by a certain moral ambiguity. Mothers and fathers could bribe school officials if they thought their child was not proficient at swimming and might drown. They gave the priests a turkey or other food to let their boy go. As the priests became more professionalized and integrated into the state, they typically held more authority. According to the Nahua ceremonial calendar, sacred victims pass away once a month. Tenochtitlan experienced so many monthly deaths of sacrificial victims by the end of Moctezuma's rule that many priests had to dedicate their entire time to planning, coordinating, and cleaning up after the deaths. After cleaning them, they plastered the skulls into superb zompantlis, skull racks. In addition to killing specially costumed god impersonators, they also killed a variety of common prisoners, whose corpses, lying on the lower steps, were thought to embrace the god figure as they descended the pyramid. The priests who drugged the victims, bound them, took their hearts out, and set fire to their remains must have become accustomed to their behavior over time. Since the beginning, priests have handled the deceased's remains to create potions infused with spiritual energy. Elite households now received portions of the sacred stew to consume, literally and figuratively. A growing percentage of the populace was impacted by this practice as the polygynous noble families expanded quickly. Moctezuma spent much time performing a selfless function, often called upon to participate in pivotal events during dozens of monthly rituals. He would have been too busy participating in the gory public ceremonies to visit the battlefield anymore. Mexican society could not have devoted so much time, labor, and mental energy to death rituals just a few decades ago. However, their strength allowed them to do so in later decades. They believed the practice reduced distant enemies to terror, so their leaders were convinced they should do so if possible. By this point, the issue of human sacrifice was obviously viewed with cynicism by several powerful individuals and their priests. They would capture some of the men and take them to Tenochtitlan when they were waging war on peoples on the outskirts of their empire that they wanted to include in the realm. Instead of forcing them to watch in a public procession where they might be offered sacrifices, they would do this secretly. They were then set free to inform their people of what would happen to them if they did not agree to Mexican terms amicably. Thus, they were undone and disunited, a man who had witnessed these sights subsequently remarked. 67. In the month of Tlacaxi-Pualtli, Moctezuma particularly enjoyed taking these tourists to witness the gladiator tutorial sacrifice ceremony, in which captured warriors were made to fight for their lives only to be killed. The lovely city's neatly organized, well-maintained operations undoubtedly had a dark side. The most affluent residents of the Central Valley were occasionally even in danger from the levers of power. Just before Moctezuma took office in 1498, several of the city's most prominent families brought their daughters to nearby Texcoco to see a terrifying spectacle that taught them self-control and obedience. Axayacatl had married off his daughter, Jade Doll, also known as Chalchiuxnenetsin, like her tragic aunt, to the young Nezahualpilli, the boy he had placed on the Texas throne years before his death. The two young people realized they couldn't get along as they aged. Considering her father's character, Jade Doll might have been conceited. His daughter was left vulnerable by Axayacatl's passing. The throne in Tenochtitlan was now occupied by her uncle Ahuitzotl, who had never recognized Axayacatl's selection before him. He certainly desired a different primary wife for Nezahualpilli. According to gossip, the Mexican princess had cheated on at least 2 men. Nezahualpilli either thought she had cheated on him, or the antagonistic Ahuitzotl persuaded him that he had to act as though he did. He ordered the strangling and stoning of his wife, her lovers, and everyone who had covered for them, as mandated by law for all adults. An older woman would remember the day's events many years later. People from different towns came to see what was happening. Women brought their daughters, who might still be in the crib, to observe the events. Some, even. Although we were enemies, Tlaxcalans and people from Huexotzinco and Atlixco came to see us. 68. She recalled that Nezahualpilli had restored his honor by throwing a feast that, to her as a child, was more memorable than the public executions, and exceeded any feast the Mexica had ever hosted. What happened to Huexotzincatzin is a long story that illuminates politics and gender at the peak of Mexican power. One stood out as particularly valued among his father's Nezahualpilli's women. She was not from a noble lineage, but was the daughter of a merchant from Tula. Thus, the bards did not even give her name, as they nearly always did for princesses, but merely called her a lady from Tula. What made her famous was not her beauty, for there were many beautiful women in the household of any Tlatoani, but rather her ability to spin poems and turn them into songs like any man. She was not the only woman with this skill. The art of speaking was always valued in the Nawa world, and other women are on record as having been painters, speakers, and singers. But among young women, who were ideally supposed to be demure, she was nevertheless a rarity. However, the Lady of Tula's subsequent troubles did not stem from her gender identity or public assertiveness. Instead, she, along with everyone else, became entangled in the perilous politics arising from polygyny. The performers in the courtyard performances of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and others always engaged in a reciprocal exchange. It was expected that representatives of multiple subalterns would present their version of a historical crisis, or that multiple nobles would present a song honoring a leader or commemorating a battle. Each performer would take their turn in succession, understanding that the expression of divergent opinions served to unite people. However, Huexotzincatzin and the Lady of Tula became famous for something quite different. They were known for writing works that were addressed directly to each other, as well as for being witty and teasing in front of an audience. We can, however, get a positive sense of the possibilities. One must have sung a perennial favorite about the fragility of flowers and the fleeting nature of earthly joys, a song that would have flowed easily from the heart of a woman taken from the land of her birth to serve others until her death. We have the lyrics of dozens of Nahua song poems from the era that overlap in theme and metaphor, but we do not know exactly which lines were their favorites or how they spun them into new works, as all performers did. You are a giver of jade stones. You unfold them, spun like feathers. You give flower crowns to princes, the singer responded. The creator god was able to bring happiness despite the sufferings of the earth. If Huexotzincatzin had responded to this salvo with a typical poem of joy and laughter instead of continuing the lament, or if he had continued with the same kind of song laced with sadness, the audience would have been surprised by the sudden change in genre. Still, he looked directly and meaningfully at the creator of the dialogue, reminding her that she would not be forgotten like all who have lived on earth. He could have easily referred to their common Nahua ancestors, for the songs were full of such images, while praising her beauty. The old song, known in Itzcoatl's day, went as follows. You died among the mesquite plants of the 7 caves. The jaguar screamed as the eagle called. And you, a red flamingo, were flying forward from the middle of a field to a place unknown. Reading the songs that have survived, listening to their cadences, and observing their potent imagery reveals that there were countless opportunities for a charged literary encounter. No matter what the two young poets did, the aging Nezawalpili could not accept that the lady was the king's wife and Huexotzincatsin was his son. Since the offender was his son, he undoubtedly would have handled the situation privately, under normal circumstances. Moctezuma the Younger, however, had been searching for a reason to unseat Huexotzincatsin as the heir apparent in Tenochtitlan, and now he had one. He desired the heir of the Texcocan king to be a close relative of his own, someone who would always follow his instructions. His nephew Cacama, a son of Nezahualpilli by a granddaughter of Tlacaelel, appeared to be a plausible contender. But before starting a civil war in the Central Valley, he had to eliminate Huexotzincatsin and his many brothers. The older woman who recalled witnessing the 1498 executions also recalled the strangling of Huexotzincatsin a few years later, in the mid-1500s. It was not to her liking. Rumors circulated that Nezahualpilli had isolated himself in his palace to cope with his sorrow, to which she added, he faced punishment simply for writing songs dedicated to the Lady of Tula. Moctezuma, however, had been unyielding. He asserted that allowing the nobles to break the law and deceive their fathers would lead to anarchy. He insisted on tightening the cord around Huexotzincatsin's pretty neck. Although no source specifically mentions the fate of the Lady of Tula, it is safe to assume that she also perished, as other sources depict the punishment of the offenders in pairs. Moctezuma likely believed that his nephew could secure the throne by intimidating Huexotzincatsin's younger siblings. Two of the older ones started haggling immediately, accepting titles and lands still held by their sons and grandsons in the 1560s. Moctezuma left the younger boys alone in a tactical blunder because he did not see them as a threat. They were among the first to ally with the newcomers from across the ocean a few years later.